अंजुमन अंजुमन शना साए, अंजुमन अंजुमन शना, बैठ जाओ बेटा, साए फिर भी दिल का नसीब तन्हाई, अंजुमन अंजुमन। अंजुमन कहते हैं उठने बैठने की जगह को, जहाँ आदमी बैठता उठता है, और हर उठने बैठने यारों के साथ शनासाई जान पहचान तो बहुत है, लेकिन फिर भी दिल का नसीब तन्हाई। ये शेर का थोड़ा सा मैंने बताया। शेर देखिए क्या है। खुश्क आंखों से उम्र भर रोए, खुश्क आंखों से, खुश्क आंखों से आंखों आंखों से, खुश्क आंखों से उम्र भर रोए, हो न जाए, हो न जाए, हो न जाए किसी की रुसवाई, फिर भी दिल का नसीब तन्हाई, अंजुमन अंजुमन शना साए, फिर भी दिल का नसीब तन्हाई। दूसरा शेर हासिल गजल है। क्या बात, क्या बात। हाँ, जब किसी ने जब किसी ने जब किसी ने मिजाज गम पूछा, जब किसी ने जब किसी ने जब किसी ने मिजाज गम पूछा, जब किसी ने मिजाज गम पूछा, दिल तड़प उठा, आँख भर आई, फिर भी दिल का नसीब तन्हाई, अंजुमन अंजुमन शना साए, फिर भी दिल का नसीब तन्हाई, अंजुमन। ये गजल है सर। इसके बाद दूसरी पेश कर सकता हूँ। हेलो,
वाह वाह, कीजिए। बिल्कुल बिल्कुल।
हाँ, थोड़ा सा आप अपनी आवाज बढ़ा लें तो थोड़ा आपकी हौसला अफजाई तो सुन ले। आपकी आवाज कम आ रही थी।
आप यहाँ वॉल्यूम कम है, फोन का वॉल्यूम बढ़ा लीजिए, हम तो सब ठीक ठीक कर।
अच्छा अच्छा, मेरा फुल है भैया, और पहले सही आ रही थी, ये अचानक क्या हो गया?
तो कुछ गड़बड़ है।
हाँ, तो कुछ गड़बड़। तो कैन आई सिंग अनदर गजल?
यस प्लीज।
जी जी
यस प्लीज,
ओके।
प्लीज इरशाद।
क्या बात। किसको कातिल मैं कहूँ, किसको मसीहा समझूं, सब यहाँ दोस्त ही बैठे हैं, किसे क्या समझूं, किसको कातिल मैं कहूँ, किसको मसीहा समझूं। क्या बात। दिल जो टूटा तो कई हाथ दुआ को उठे, दिल जो टूटा, दिल जो टूटा तो कई हाथ दुआ को उठे, ऐसे माहौल में अब किस को पराया समझूं, ऐसे माहौल में अब किस को पराया समझूं, किसको कातिल मैं कहूँ, किसको मसीहा समझूं। और एक ये आखिरी गजल, ये गुलाम अली साहब की हम लेते हैं।
आशीष, मैं एक इंटरप्शन करूंगा यहाँ पर छोटा सा।
हाँ जी जी, इंट्रोडक्शन करा।
ये हमारे ये फॉर दोज हु हैव ट्यून्ड इन अ लिटिल लेट, या जिनको याद नहीं हो कि आशीष कौन है, तो आशीष इज द सन ऑफ आनंद शुक्ला जी। आनंद शुक्ला जी ने आपसे 32 साल पहले हरिप्रसाद चौरसिया के साथ हमारे ही कैंपस पर तबला बजाया था और बेहतरीन बजाया था। हरि जी ने भी उनको उनकी प्रशंसा की थी, और आज उन्हीं के बेटे हमारे लिए ये गजलें सुना रहे हैं। एक बार आनंद जी के भी दर्शन करवा दो भाई।
हाँ जी प्लीज।
नमस्कार साहब, बहुत बहुत तहे दिल से आपका सबका प्यार, आशीर्वाद, मोहब्बत भरी, सबको खूब तरक्की करें, खूब खुश रहें, और खूब इस बीमारी के माहौल में भी सबके चेहरे में चमक ऐसी बनी रहे और सुरों से भीगे रहे आप लोग।
थैंक यू सर, थैंक यू, थैंक यू,
थैंक यू सर।
एक गजल मैं भी सुनाऊंगा इसके बाद आपको।
उसके पहले हमारे, हाँ जी, तो हमारे कॉलेज के दिनों पर इसी गजल की एक और इस गजल में एक और लाइन है जो हम सब के लिए एप्लीकेबल है या हम सब के लिए लागू होती है। तो वो लाइन मुझे याद है, इसके लिए मैं आपको बता दे रहा हूँ।
आप बताएं प्लीज।
बताइए भैया।
वो भी क्या दिन थे कि हर वहम यकीन होता था, वो वाले दिन थे। वो भी
अब हकीकत नजर आए तो मैं क्या समझूं। हाँ तो इरशाद करता हूँ।
वाह वाह। वो भी क्या दिन
अब
वो भी क्या वो
वो भी क्या दिन अब हकीकत नजर
उससे क्या नजर उससे क्या
और एक भैया जगजीत सिंह जी का मौसम बन रहा है तो उन्हीं की ले लेते हैं लास्ट गजल। एक
तन्हा
तन्हा ओ मर जाएगा,
मर जाएगा।
ओ प्यार घड़ी भर का ही बहुत है, ओ प्यार घड़ी भर का ही बहुत है, झूठा सच्चा मत सोचा कर, झूठा सच्चा मत सोचा कर, मर जाएगा, हाँ मर जाएगा, मत सोचा कर, गा सकते तन्हा मत सोचा कर।
धूप में साया
कर जाता है,
धूप में तन्हा कर जाता है, साया
ओ मर जाएगा, मर जाएगा, मत सोचा कर, तन्हा तन्हा मत सोचा कर। हाँ दीपेन भैया।
सर मजा आया,
बहुत अच्छे, बहुत अच्छे। थैंक यू, थैंक यू, थैंक यू। हम लोग आपके आभारी हैं, शुक्रगुजार हैं।
अरे
आपने
माय प्लेजर, माय प्लेजर,
काम की शानदार शुरुआत की है। और आई थिंक संदीप, इट इज टाइम नाउ टू कॉल रजत।
या
नहीं संदीप जी,
तो अब हमारा जो एक्चुअल एजेंडा है वो स्टार्ट होता है।
श्योर,
आप चाहें तो रुक सकते हैं। ये
बिल्कुल
वायरस
बिल्कुल
के बारे में ही हमारे एक बैचमेट हैं जो बात करने वाले हैं कि ये वायरस कैसे फैलता है।
मैं भी लुत्फ उठाऊंगा।
हाँ जरूर जरूर, प्लीज स्टे बैक।
इंशाल्लाह, क्या बात।
संदीप,
Vishwa, please take over and then yeah.
Hi Rajat.
Hey, is that who's that, Dimple or Anshu?
That's Amita.
Amita, oh, great. Get to hear your voice.
Yeah, it's yours as well. Good to see you again, buddy.
Yeah, it's been what, a year?
Yeah.
Wow. It is so nice to see all these names. I haven't connected with so many of these people in such a long time.
Acha, before Rajat starts, Rajat, this is Rohit.
बेटा वो उधर चलो ईशा कह दो कि हरी डायरी दे दे हरी डायरी गाने वाली.
People need to turn on the cameras. We need to see the good faces at least initially. Then bandwidth might be limited.
रजत तुम अभी फ्लूइड डायनामिक्स के बारे में बताने वाले हो जो तुमको वॉलीबॉल मैसेज बताया था ना, वॉलीबॉल में कैसे बॉल क्रॉस करता है नेट में विद द फ्लूइड डायनामिक्स, वो सारी इक्वेशन आज काम आ रहा है तुम्हारे.
I hope this works better than volleyball, man. We lost every game. Hey, Harshanshu.
आशीष शुक्ला जी, आप जरा म्यूट पे कर लीजिए.
कि यहाँ पर वियतनाम में अभी 11 बज रहा है रात का.
हेलो.
हेलो. Hi Rajat.
Hey, how are you all? I see my buddy, my volleyball buddy Ajit Narayan somewhere. Where is Ajit? अभी तो था अजीत, निकल गया क्या? गाना सुन के चला गया.
म्यूट. अच्छा म्यूट में. हाँ म्यूट में ही है. लो व्हाट्सएप में लिखते कि इट इज ऑन.
रजत sometimes ना ये वेब के थ्रू कनेक्शन है.
तेरा रोहित, I can't make out what you're saying. आवाज नहीं आ रही है.
Okay, so what I'm saying is कि ये जो संगीत का प्रोग्राम है, it's still in the testing mode. So sometimes people disconnect.
Yeah, no. Okay. If Ajit doesn't come back, he's going to get a national yell from me. So, by the way, it says 28 people. I don't see all the 28. So I need to scroll down or something.
बताओ उसको, सैंडी राज को बताओ कैसे टेक्निकल सपोर्ट चाहिए उसको.
Wow.
No, it's off. I can still see him.
So by the way, I forwarded this to Aditi and to Dimple. I don't know if they're on the mailing list or not.
I believe they are.
Okay.
But I can't promise they check that email. It hasn't bounced.
Okay. All right. I see Ankil. I see Suranjan. I haven't seen Sanjay. I saw a little while back. Suranjan भैया क्या हाल है?
All good, Rajat. Looking forward to it. I saw your messages about going to Vail, your trips to Vail last week.
That was amazing. Yeah. I still have the glow of vacation on me right now.
एक महीना पहले हम लोग रॉकी माउंटेन नेशनल पार्क गए थे on the other side.
Okay, yeah.
So that was fun.
Yeah, no.
So I see Krishna Gopal is here. He also is expert in fluid dynamics of hitting a curved ball to the goal. Yeji, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. How are you guys?
Good, good. So Krishna, you're in somewhere in Texas?
I am, yes.
Okay.
Police station, right in the middle.
Okay.
So back from your hike, huh?
Back from my hike and finally over my soreness. Actually, it was. I was very sore.
14,000 feet is no mean thing.
Yeah, 14,000. That was fun actually, but I must say we did a couple of other hikes that were tougher than 14,000, except they were lower altitude, but we had to trek through snow. So that was unexpected and kind of interesting fun. Reminded me of IIT trekking. I don't know, IIT में कौन गया था हमारे साथ to Sandakphu? No, Sandakphu नहीं. क्या नाम था? Yamdar Glacier. Right?
I went to one trek in Valley of Flowers and all that stuff. Do you remember?
No, there was one trek where we went from Mori. We trekked all the way up to close to Yamdar Glacier. I know Sanjay Sarma was there. I know Vigyan was there.
Was that the Harki Dun one?
Harki Dun, yes.
Yeah, that was fun.
So I think Harki Dun was close to 14,000 feet.
Yeah.
It was probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember we went to Kulu Manali trip. वो भी उतना ही था शायद. I think it was 12,000 some feet above the snow line. All memories.
Right.
And Anshu had to suffer that trip with us, by the way.
That's right. I think we were 14 or 15 of us.
Yes.
Rama and Anshu.
So by the way, Vishwa, I forwarded this link to some of my colleagues at Hopkins. So there might be some non-IITK people who might log into. So don't be alarmed.
Oh, the more the merrier. I think we should discuss at some point. Should we actually make it open to other IITs and different batches?
Yeah.
And especially talks this worthy. I mean, I don't think every talk will be that worthy. I hope it will be, but might not be. And we can also invite speakers. I know a lot of people from other batches also.
Right.
And I had this.
For it, give money to Pradeep Bhargav.
Yeah.
That way, I hope it helps Sandeep's cause as well. I like this Made in India thing.
Yeah, it will take all the load. All IITK can come here. All of you.
Before the non-IITK people join, I had a question. So how much of this work is inspired by ESC 207, Rami Singh's class?
Are you asking me, Sriram?
Yeah.
No, actually, it is inspired. That was one of the few courses I got an A in, and that pretty much determined my career path. So.
We should have called him. We should have called him to this.
But actually, we were taught by Vijay Gupta. ESCO 7 was taught by Vijay Gupta.
Oh, really? Okay. They split it that year. Okay. Vijay Gupta was a great, teacher as well. I mean, he was there at our Silver Jubilee reunion.
Yeah. Is that right? Yeah, I missed that.
Hey, Rajat. This is Atul here.
Yeah.
Just trying to figure out how come you got into medicine and engineering both. What's the secret behind that?
No, there's no secret. So there's no secret. So basically, fluid dynamics actually connects with everything. We are pretty much made up of fluid. 90% by volume, human beings are fluid. We are surrounded by fluid. So actually, it turns out there's a very direct connection between fluid dynamics and medicine. And actually, before I got into engineering and started studying for IIT, I was really interested in biology, but didn't really see a real path forward with biology. So this is just my way of coming back to my old love, which was biology, combining fluid dynamics and biology together. So it's turned out to be a really interesting path for me. And then coming to Hopkins about 10 years ago, what I was doing in terms of cardiovascular fluid dynamics and respiration and all that was a very nice fit for Hopkins, Johns Hopkins. And so I have a secondary appointment in School of Medicine. I don't treat any patients. I better not. I'll be sued. So I'm a professor of medicine, but I don't treat patients. I just have a secondary appointment, and I basically conduct research. And what that allows me to do is have medical residents and fellows and things like that come and work in my lab.
So Rajat, not to worry. We are all fake doctors.
Yeah, I know.
No, we are all fake engineers as well. At least most of us are.
And Rajat, your other research on the dolphin stuff and making these skins for the Olympic swim team, it came on NPR. I mean, I actually heard it. I said, "Is it the same guy? Same Rajat Mittal who was there?" And so that was also very interesting, fascinating, and became quite well known. That work of yours.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, so that's another passion of mine is working in something called bioinspiration, biomimetics, which is, what can we learn from nature as engineers? What can we learn from nature, and how can we translate that into kind of engineered devices, products, solutions? So we've been looking at how insects fly, how birds fly, how fish swim, humans swim. So again, the beauty is that everything is happening in fluid dynamics because everything is surrounded by air or water. So it's very central to kind of all the things that we do. So, yeah.
But the third most fascinating thing was I was playing tennis with Vineet Gupta. So we were talking about your this upcoming lecture, and he says, in way back there's some Jacobian some math theorem that you guys do, and that came on New York Times. So this is Vineet telling me about your work. So that was 3 pieces of work from you. That's quite impressive, actually.
So Jacobi method paper was completely, I would say, was a graduate student of mine. He's a Chinese student, absolutely brilliant chap, absolutely brilliant. And he was in my first lecture of my numerical methods class, and I told him something that the Jacobi method cannot be accelerated. And he came back to me and said, "Hey, professor, I think you're wrong." I'm like, "What? I've been teaching this for 20 years. And then within a week, he explained to me why I was wrong. And then he and I worked on that paper. So it was mostly his doing. I just kind of directed him. But that was the one paper where I thought the only paper that I got a comment back from any saying great work. So anyway, it's almost 12:10. So should we get started?
Can other people go on mute, please?
Vishwa, should I get started?
10 over. I mean, unless people want to chat for a little bit, we can get started because it gets late in India. Then Deepen will probably go to sleep. He used to sleep in the lectures anyway, but I mean, if it makes a difference to him.
Rubbish. I'm going to stay up.
That's the spirit, man.
Go ahead, Vishwa. Do a formal intro and then let's start.
There is no formal intro. I mean, who doesn't know Rajat? I mean, my formal intro is I told him, what kind of picture have you put on your profile page? It should be like jumping up like 6 feet in the air and then smashing the volleyball. That's how I remembered him, by the way.
That's the best way to remember me because that was the best part of IIT, actually, playing volleyball.
Yeah. I mean, people used to wonder, how can this guy actually jump so high? But now I know, I mean, the guy was interested in fluid dynamics from the beginning. He was studying how birds fly, so he probably gathered something. I will have to see the videos to see whether he was living in tents before that or something or what. He used to just take off. All right, Rajat, without further ado, please. The floor is yours.
Let me know when you can, if you all can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Yes, we can see it now. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So actually, this is a updated version of a talk I gave about a month ago at a conference in London. Obviously, did it remotely. Sandeep did it via Zoom, but maybe next time I do a conference, I'll insist on using Voxomeet.
Hey, Rajat, before you start, let me just say one thing. So people those of you who don't know, in Sandeep's program, there's this menu item where you see a lot of dots. If you click on it, you can have a speaker view and you can see the slides on full screen. I don't know if everybody knows that. Sandeep Rosa's technical support kar do.
Ending very good technical support from the other folks. Yes, so those 3 dots you can do a view full screen. That will slightly make it better.
So Sandeep, you're asking me, I couldn't make out. You're asking me to go full screen?
No, for you it's fine. You okay. Go ahead. This is for the others. Yes.
All right. So if everybody can see my screen, I'll get started. So the title is somewhat provocative, and kind of is driven by my own frustration about what, as I saw this COVID kind of spreading in the world and especially in the US, to try and figure out kind of what the dimensions of our knowledge of transmission of COVID-19 is. So just to keep this current, actually, this graph that I'm showing you here is today's daily cases. So you can see that, as always, America is leading the world in everything, including the number of infections. So very, very fast. We had this initial kind of exponential rise out here. Then we managed to control things, and then things are again out of control here. So this brings to fore the notion that we don't really understand what is going on, and maybe there is some new way of thinking that is needed to really understand what's going on. So and again, we talked a little bit about why I can be talking about something like this, whereas my degrees are in mechanical engineering, etc. But it turns out that the vast majority of the transmission factors and the pathways of COVID transmission, all of them have to do with fluid dynamics, and that's really kind of where my connection is. About 3 months ago, in sometime early April, I had not worked in COVID or airborne transmission of this disease, etc. at all, but I was feeling very frustrated that we are all sitting on the sidelines watching this thing spiral out of control. And that was a time I kind of decided to see, okay, what can I do as an engineer, scientist, as a fluid mechanician, as a somebody who has a joint appointment in engineering and medicine. I should be able to do something. And what that something initially was to actually really gather together this kind of information database about what we know and what we don't know about how this disease is being transmitted. So a few kind of quick thoughts here to get started. So first of all, the the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the size of the virus is about 70 to 90 nanometers. So we're talking about something of the size of tens or hundreds of nanometers. It's kind of fairly well established that there are 3 ways of transmitting the virus from an infected person to a non-infected person. There is something called the Droplet Route. So you see out here this little cartoon where you have an infected person in red, and that person is speaking, talking, breathing, shouting, coughing, sneezing. And when a person does that, there are droplets that are expelled from the mouth and nose of the person, and these droplets contain virus particles. And the droplet route, the first route is the large particles are going to directly kind of impact somebody else. So if somebody else happens to be in front of somebody who's coughing, then those droplets impact directly the other person's nose or mouth, and that's how the infection starts. So that's called the droplet route. And typically this happens with larger droplets because the larger droplets have sufficient inertia that they can actually move forward kind of almost like a ballistic trajectory. The other route, which is also connected with the large droplets, is what is called the contact route, or called the fomite route, which is that these large droplets will fall onto some surfaces. They'll fall onto tables and chairs and computer screens and door handles and all that. And then somebody else who's not infected grabs, touches that place with the contaminated surface, and then touches their mouth or nose or eyes, and that's kind of called the contact route. And the initial stages of COVID transmission, everybody was worried about these first 2 routes, the droplet route and the contact route. And that's why the whole idea of hand washing and everything was being pushed very, very hard by all the agencies and governments and things like that. And also the whole idea of the 6 feet social distancing actually comes from the droplet route, because these large droplets typically only can travel about 6 feet or 10 feet or whatever. But what has become very clear over the last 2 months is that it's actually this third route which is the most insidious and most dangerous, which is what is called the airborne transmission route. And basically, this is the route which involves the smallest droplets. So these are droplets that are smaller than 10 microns. And when you have droplets that are smaller than 10 microns, then these droplets basically become like microscopic particles that can actually float in the air. And once they can float in the air, they can actually travel very long distances on air currents, and then somebody else can inhale them. So this whole airborne transmission route involves small droplets that are suspended in the air and which can be inhaled directly by somebody else. So that's what creates the danger, is first of all, long distance transmission. Secondly, the fact that it can be directly inhaled by a person. So these droplets can actually go directly into the lungs of the person and deposit there, where they can lead to the infection. So a little bit of, and by the way, you know, as a professor, I've gotten used to talking and talking and talking. Please interrupt me. I can't really see the faces of other people as I'm talking, so I don't kind of have a visual feedback in terms of whether somebody is confused, somebody is raising their hands. So please, please, please stop me. This is as informal as it gets. You know, I'm talking to a group of really, really smart people here, so I'm expecting some really good questions. Harsh, I know for sure that you got an A in fluid dynamics, so I absolutely expect a lot of questions from you. Harsh, you're listening? You've gone to sleep already?
Hey, Rajat, this is a question. Like, you know, I got a question for you. Like, you know, is there a viral load required for infection? Like, you know, so would that airborne route of, you know, wouldn't have sufficient viral load to infect the person, or
yeah, yeah, excellent question. So actually half of my talk is going to focus on that. So that'll be in the next few slides.
Okay.
All right. So other questions? All right. So a little bit about terminology. So I don't know if many of you have been reading, I'm sure, about things, and they talk about droplets and they talk about droplet nuclei. So droplet is nothing but
other questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So a little bit about terminology. So I don't know if many of you have been reading, I'm sure, about things that they talk about.
Sorry, can't make out what you're saying.
Droplet is not other questions.
That seems like a recording of the talk.
Hey, I think if we can go off video, everyone else, that might decrease the bandwidth and might be better than everyone go on mute.
All right, so I think maybe catch that question later. So it's become very clear that the airborne route is actually the most dangerous. In fact, you know, there's been a whole bunch of scientists who have sent letters to WHO and everybody else showing the clear evidence that, in fact, airborne route, transmission route is the most dangerous route, something that has been ignored so far. So a little bit about terminology. So droplets are nothing but little, you know, as it suggests, it's the little droplets of fluid. The fluid is usually mucus. And these droplets, when they come out, they're very small and they immediately start to dry up because they're moving so fast relative to their size that basically because of mass transfer, they can start to dry up very quickly. Within 2 seconds, actually, most of the smaller droplets will dry up quite a bit, and they'll form what is called droplet nuclei, which is nothing but the same droplet with most of the water content evaporated. So all you have is kind of the chemicals, all the kind of biomolecules that are there in the mucus, and maybe if there's a virus, there'll be a virus inside that evaporated droplet. And typically the size of these things, droplet nuclei will be less than a micron, smaller droplets will be less than 5 microns. So
Rajat, there is a question from Surajit, which is, how long is long range? Like, how long is long? That's a question from Surajit Basu.
Yeah, so long range all depends on what kind of air currents there are. So, and I'll come to this in a few minutes, but these droplets can stay suspended for hours, and the virus can survive for up to 3 hours in the aerosol. So in principle, if you have wind flow, in 3 hours, the wind could go from here to, it could go to the next zip code. In an internal environment like an office building, it could go from one floor to another floor through the ventilation system. So long distance can be very long distance. Of course, the farther you go out, the more diluted the aerosol becomes. So that comes back to the earlier question about the viral load. So those things become very important.
So Rajat, another question. So I keep hearing that this is something that's not alive. You mentioned it can survive. So is it a living thing or a non-living thing?
All right, that's a big question for. So in principle, virus are not considered to be part of the living order of things. So because they cannot really replicate on their own, they need another cell. They need material from a host cell to be able to replicate. So they don't have the whole machinery to be able to replicate independent of a host. So from that point of view, they do not satisfy the definition of life for living creature.
Hey,
okay,
Rajat, I have a question on this.
Sorry, let me just add to that. So, but one still talks about kind of viable versus non-viable virus, and in that sense, you can think of, people talk about, oh, the virus is still living. When they say virus is still living, what they mean is that the virus is still viable in the sense that it can infect the host. It is fully intact in a way that it can infect the host. All right, sorry, go ahead.
So I mean, it is on the just a little more question. So I mean, how does it go away on its own?
You mean inside the body?
If it is sitting on the table, let's say, why can't it be there for years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you see on the picture up above, it's not very clear, but you see the red kind of peripheral lining of the virus. That red peripheral lining is what is called a lipid covering. It's basically a covering made up of fat cells, and those fat cells are basically they protect the RNA that's inside the virus. Anything that damages the lipid covering will essentially destroy the contents of the virus, and multiple things can do that. Dehydration can do that. So if you fully dehydrate the droplet, eventually the lipid cells need hydration to survive. If you do UV exposure, UV can kill again, it can cause cellular damage, it can kill it. And then of course, hand washing. Soap is extremely good at destroying fat molecules. So that's why hand washing helps.
So in moist environment, it can stay for a long period of time?
Yeah, so very kind of a quick answer to that, yes. If you have higher humidity, then the evaporation rate, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on in the talk. But yes, but if you guys wait for a second, you'll see some of this stuff coming up.
So Rajat, I'm sure you might talk about it later, but usually the fat molecules or the fat spikes that you see, have you tested whether they are hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Because then that at a molecular level might just keep the water molecules around it while it's flying out, even if it's dehydrated, as you are saying. It might travel thousands of kilometers.
So by the way, the spikes are proteins. So the spikes themselves are proteins. They're not fat molecules. And that's the protein. Those protein spikes those spikes are where the attachment points of these virus to host cells. That's what penetrates into the host cell and kind of delivers the RNA into the thing. Hydrophobic, hydrophilic, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that. But in either case, it seems like the viability of the virus is about order of a few hours in the aerosol, and beyond that, it really is not able to survive. The level of dehydration becomes sufficient that it's not able to survive, and then also outdoors UV exposure.
Right.
So a little bit of a ESCO7. Somebody was talking about ESCO7 alert. So here's Harsh. This is the question that's coming up for you at the end. So basically, what decides whether a particle can stay suspended in the air or not? And it turns out it's kind of the Reynolds number, or more specifically, the Stokes number. So the Stokes number is the ratio of the time scale of a typical particle settling to the time scale of the flow around it. And as long as this value is less than 1, then those particles can suspend in the air forever. And if you look at a 5-micron particle, the typical Stokes number for that is going to be about 0.25. So basically, these particles will never ever, particles that are that small will never settle down. There's not, the drag on these particles is so large compared to gravitational force that they pretty much have an infinite suspension time. So that's kind of the danger about these particles, that they will stay suspended forever. Just like you have pollen, just like you have pollution particles, NOx particles, dust particles, these things, dust particles tend to be a little bit larger, but these things can stay suspended forever.
Hey, hang in, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, and
tell me who, I need to know who you are. I'd love to know the names of who's asking me questions.
Yeah, so this is Dipen, and I'm going to switch on my camera as I say this because it matters. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me now, but I don't think. Anyway, so the question is actually quite serious. मतलब ये सब इसको 7 के फंडे दे रहे हो, बहुत सारे बैच के सामने जलील करने को बुलाया है क्या?
Hey, these are, you know, I'm in the presence of some really big minds here. You know, minds that we had a tough time keeping up with. So in the one course that I got an A, I have the right to actually brag about it, right? By the way, thermodynamics was a D, and most math was C. So we have a lot of buckets here.
Okay, thermo was a C. I beat you.
There we go. All right, let me get, how do I get back to full screen? To my camera.
So that means you have to find the vaccine for this or a cure.
So,
Rajat, you just hover down. If you hover, those controls will come.
Hey, Rajat, if gravity, if the Stokes number is such that the gravity doesn't pull it down, electrostatic charges might. So maybe that's the way to filter rather than normal filters.
So I can hold on. Let me figure out how to get to my presentation back. Then I'll answer that question too.
So the third from bottom, you click on that, the tile view. Yeah.
Rajat, what grade did you get in the CS course?
Bottom right.
Bottom right. Hold on one second, ladies and gentlemen. I'm trying to get back to my view full screen, something like that. Stop live stream. No. What do I do?
No. The third button.
Third from where?
I think from the bottom right.
So the one with the multiple kind of windows showing in it.
Yeah, the this kind of stuff. Just click that.
Okay. How about I think that under window came. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can see you.
No, my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation again?
No. So what you do is you go to the left, bottom left. Okay.
Bottom left.
Click. So if you have start screen sharing or stop screen sharing.
All right.
So you just toggle that and start again. Yeah.
Okay. How about now?
Not yet.
Have starts. Yes. Now it's there.
Okay. All right. So sorry, there was a question from somebody.
This is Amita. I just have a comment. I would love to hear the rest of Rajat's presentation, and I know these questions are really good and we do have some brilliant minds, but I would appreciate it if we could let him continue with the presentation and then we could perhaps ask the questions towards the end. It is 11:30 at night here, so I'd love to just see Rajat's presentation if that's okay.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
You brought it on, so we are gonna keep quiet.
All right, so let's get to the presentation. So basically, you know, So this is kind of the overall idea. And now airborne transmission, I'm going to focus on airborne transmission. And this is part of that, I wrote this kind of a perspective paper about 2-3 months ago, talking about everything kind of that we need to understand about COVID. So bottom line is, here on the left, you have an infected person. On the right, you have an uninfected person. So somehow the virus has to get from this red person to the green person. And there are multiple stages to this. So there is, and everything involves kind of physics and flow physics. So first is the generation of droplets. How are these droplets formed inside our body? That's number one. Then once the droplets are formed, these droplets need to be expelled out from our mouth and our noses. Then third one, they have to kind of disperse and travel all the way to the other uninfected person. And finally, the final stage is the person who, person has to inhale those droplets to get infected. So when I kind of started to think about, all this different news that was coming out, face mask, good or bad, not use it, don't use it, are they working, don't work, 6 feet is enough or not, WHO is saying 3 feet, somebody else says 6 feet, somebody else says, I don't care about social distancing. So, question was, and I was, I've been talking to people from biology, epidemiology, there's public health people involved, medicine, physics, engineering, and public policy, of course, media. So everybody's kind of trying to understand this, all of this, and there is no kind of a uniform framework that I felt that could be easy to explain to everybody. And so that's kind of what got started me thinking about coming up with a framework that could potentially allow one to explain and to understand everything that's involved. And there's too much involved here. So I think that's a little too ambitious, but at least kind of, is it possible to do something like that? And so that's where actually, as Sanjay and I were talking, and I was telling Sanjay that I wish I could derive something like a Drake equation for COVID transmission. And we are all geeks here on this, geeks and nerds here. So I'm pretty much assuming that the vast majority of us know what the Drake equation is. But for those who don't know what the Drake equation is, basically it's an equation derived by a professor in 1960s or 70s who was leading the SETI Institute. And they're trying to find radio capable life somewhere else in Milky Way. And after doing that for a while, he said, what, we are doing all this, but we really don't understand what the variables are involved in the possibility that life can exist somewhere else. So he came up with this equation, which is basically, it's a bunch of probabilities. You multiply them together, and it gives you the total number of civilizations in a galaxy which are kind of radio communication capable. So this is what's called the famous Drake equation. Now, for people who kind of critics of this equation, they say that it doesn't really solve anything. It doesn't give you can't really get n from this because you don't know any of the other fractional numbers. But I think it still is very useful because it tells you all the variables that are involved in leading to a certain result. And then one can decide, using this equation, one can start to think about, okay, what is it that we know? What is it that we don't know? What do we think is important? Which variable is more important than the other? Where should funding go? If there's one unknown that is particularly important, maybe the funding agency should fund that more. Public policy, it could really inform all of those things. So that was the basic idea that I started kind of thinking about a month ago, is that can I derive an equation like this that can be made easy to understand to pretty much people from all walks of life. So that's what I'll kind of present today and see what you all think about it. So basically, to start off this equation, and this goes back to the question that was asked, the ultimate thing that we want to be able to predict is, so we have the infected host on the left and we have the susceptible person on the right. And one thing we kind of know is that if that person inhales a certain number of virus-containing droplets, then if it crosses a certain number, then that person is going to get infected. So that's the underlying assumption here, and this assumption is based on what we understand about all airborne viruses, is that you need a certain kind of a certain number of minimum kind of viruses to be embedded into your respiratory tract in order to get an infection. So there's this N number, N COVID-19. That's what I call N COVID-19. So the question now is that, what are the factors that predict the value of N, going all the way from the infected host and the susceptible person? So you'll have to forgive me, but so this is the entire equation. But actually, it's not, especially for this audience, this is not going to be very difficult to explain. So basically, to get to this number, there are factors that are associated with the infected host, which are out here on the left. There are factors associated with the susceptible person. And then there is the intermediate factors that connect the host to the susceptible. So let me just quickly go over this and explain to you kind of what my thinking is. So let's start from the left here. So this is an infected person. The first thing is that there's a rate of expulsion of particles, droplets from a person, right, from the infected person. So that's R dot, big R dot. So that's your source of infection, right? So that's the rate at which particles are coming out from, and I'll talk about the number of particles. I'll show you what we know and what we don't know about each of these. So that's the first number. Now that number, if I multiply that by the average number of viruses per droplet, then I start to get the rate at which viruses are being expelled by the person. And this is, by the way, there's a technical term for this. This is called the viral load. So this is the viral load is the amount of virus contained in any sample, so to speak. So here the sample that we're talking about is the droplets that are coming out from people's, some infected person's mouth and nose. So that's the kind of the fractional viral load. Then not if somebody is wearing a mask, then not all these droplets make through. So there's a fractional reduction due to the mask. And so this FMH refers to the fraction of droplets that will make it past the mask. And then once they're past the mask, then not all of them are going to aerosolize. Some of them are going to be still heavy. They're going to fall on the ground. But a fraction of those are going to actually get suspended in the air. So that's the fraction of droplets that aerosolize. So that's that. So all of this now depends on the infected person, who they are, what their status is, health status is, what their behavior is, all that kind of stuff. So that is what the infected person is releasing. And then out here, between this person and the susceptible, all these droplets kind of have to travel all the way, and some of them have to travel all the way to the susceptible. So this is that FHS is all the fraction of all the aerosolized droplets that are released by the infected person that manage to get to the proximity of the susceptible person with viable virons. Actually, I should have added that here, but viability is important. So this is the fraction of droplets with viable virons that makes it to the susceptible. So that's all the transmission from long distance transmission, whatever that distance is, 5 feet, 10 feet, 100 feet, all of that stuff that is happening in the intermediate is this variable. Then we get to the variables associated with the susceptible person. One is, this is FIS, is the fraction of proximal droplets that would be inhaled by a person who is not wearing a face mask. So if somebody was not wearing a face mask, they would inhale this fraction of the available droplets. If somebody was wearing a face mask, that we would add another fraction to it because the face mask would stop a certain number of particles. And then the duration of exposure is very important. So remember, this is a rate out here. We need to multiply it by a duration to get the total number anyway. So this duration becomes very important. How long are you exposed to this cloud of aerosol virus-containing aerosols? And if you take all this, you get the total number of virus-containing particles that are inhaled by the person. And if this number is greater than n, whatever this n is, then the person is going to get infected. So this is kind of the Drake equation, so to speak, of COVID transmission. And I kind of just short form, I call it the cat inequality. It's actually not an equation, it's an inequality. But this kind of encapsulates, as far as I know, pretty much all the variables and factors involved in this transmission. Now the question is, now immediately once we have this equation in front of us, now we can ask a question. Which of these factors do we know something about? Which of these factors do we don't know anything about? And which of these factors do we really need to know something about? So that's kind of the next question, is that kind of understanding the dimensions of our knowledge about each and every one of these factors. So that's kind of the, I'll get into this a little bit. So it's going to, I'll apologize for the tables and everything, but it's not possible to give this kind of a talk without some of this stuff. So, but hopefully this will still kind of be interesting and understandable. So first variable, rate of droplet expulsion from the nose and mouth of the host. So that's the RH variable. What does it depend on? Well, it depends. It turns out it depends on the virus type. CoV-1 and CoV-2 might have very different rates of droplet formation. Actually, the reason why we sneeze and cough is nothing but the virus making us sneeze and cough so that it can actually spread itself very fast. So these viruses are quote unquote very intelligent. They hijack our bodily functions and make us do things that actually spread them fast. So certainly CoV-2 has spread a lot faster than CoV-1. So certainly the type of virus will have an effect on this RH dot. It depends on the stage of the infection. We have heard that CoV-2 is being spread by asymptomatic patients, pre-symptomatic patients, so that's a big deal. It also depends on the phenotype of the host, the age of the host, any other diseases the person has, what kind of speech they are, do they speak loudly, softly, are they singing, shouting, things like that. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, and same thing, expiratory behavior. Is it happening during breathing, during talking, singing, coughing, sneezing? And all of these will produce different R dots. So each one of them is associated with a different R dot. What do we understand about this? There is actually a lot of studies on this, but there's also a lot of scatter in data. So let me give you a little bit of a background on this. So first of all, exactly how are these droplets being formed inside the respiratory tract? So basically, in our respiratory tract, we have a bunch of tubes going into our lungs, and everywhere those tubes are lined by a mucus lining. And the mucus is very important. The mucus hydrates our respiratory tract. It actually ingests all kinds of liquids that are in our mouth. It brings up saliva, and it also kills viruses, by the way. The mucus is our first line of defense against any inhaled pathogens. It actually can kill viruses. But some viruses manage to survive that. But anyway, the same mucus, so you see the mucus lining on the respiratory tract, this is where the viruses reside. And as we breathe, these bronchioles or tubes open and close periodically. And when they close completely, this mucus lining kind of comes together. And when they open, this mucus lining ruptures, and that produces these small droplets. And these droplets, since that's where the virus is, the viruses get wrapped up in these little droplets, and then a person exhales or talks or whatever, all these droplets kind of come out. So that's the essential kind of mechanism for the formation of these droplets during breathing, talking, coughing, and sneezing. So that's how they are formed. And then, kind of what do we understand about the size of these droplets, the number of these droplets, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of data. There's data going all the way back to the 1930s. So back in not the Spanish flu, but the tuberculosis kind of high rates of tuberculosis infection back in the 30s and 40s really led to a lot of these studies. So this study, for instance, this one, 1946 study out here, the classic work of people like Wells, etc. This all goes back to the 1930s. But just to give you kind of some idea about what these numbers are. So breathing, there is data that shows that every breath, you are generating anywhere from 10 to about 1,000 particles. So big spread. And some people produce more than others. So those are the people, quote unquote, who could be super spreaders, people who naturally produce a lot more droplets than other people. Tidal breathing versus deep breathing. If you are breathing normally versus, let's say after exercise in a gym, you're breathing really hard. Breathing really hard can increase the number of particles you're creating by a factor of 10. And then all the way up to sneezing. Sneezing, actually, look up here. This is a very classic study by Duguid. And he showed that actually a single sneeze can create about 1 million particles, million droplets. There's been some later work that shows that might not be true. But 100,000 particles definitely seems to be the right order of magnitude for a given sneeze. So a single sneeze can create 100,000 particles. And no wonder that all these airborne viruses make us sneeze, because sneezing and coughing is the best way to generate the largest amount of particles. There's a huge spread in the size of particles. So on the right hand side, you see the spread in size. So this is in microns. So you see particles all the way from 1 micron to almost 1,000 microns. So particles can be of very different sizes. Loudness of speech depends a lot. So on the lower left, you see here somebody who is quiet versus somebody who's talking intermediate kind of loudness and then very loud. The number of particles that are coming out kind of increases with the loudness of speech. There's research done on kind of super producers. They had 11 people. They measured the number of particles coming out of normal breathing of whatever 11 or 6 people, and they found that, you know, all the way from 14 particles per, I think this is per second or something, all the way to 3,000 particles per second. So, and these are all non-infected patients. These are all absolutely healthy people. So even healthy people have a huge variability in the amount of particles they produce during breathing. So you know, there's this whole notion that, you know, 20% of the people are generating 80% of the infections, and there is some truth to that. It might be a very few number of people who are particularly good at putting out these particles. But anyway, huge amount of variability in this data. But this data is there. We don't fully understand it, but it's kind of, the data is there. The second variable, if you remember, this is the viral load. And somebody had asked me this question earlier: what is the number of viruses that actually can be contained in this? And again, it depends on a lot of factors, and this is something that we know absolutely nothing about. There's very few studies that are showing this, that have measured this. Now, a virus size is about 90 nanometers. So even if you take a 1 micron droplet, in principle, it has enough volume to contain 1,000 viruses. But does it really contain 1,000 viruses? It turns out that if you look at the volume concentration, then by volume concentration, virus only occupy 1/1,000,000th of the volume of the mucus lining in our respiratory tract. So in principle, if you assume that all the viruses are kind of evenly spaced in the volume, then only 1 out of 1,000,000 particles should kind of have a virus. But that turns out to be not the case. Here is some data from SARS-CoV-1. So this is not SARS-CoV-2, this is SARS-CoV-1. And this is showing basically the number of virus copies that they managed to obtain from the breath of a person in a sample. And you know, you can see out here that they're getting almost like 1,000 copies, 1,000 viruses in about 30 minutes. So they collected droplets over 30 minutes from people, and then they did a culture and they tried to find out how many copies of virus do they have. So you see everywhere from 0 all the way to about 1,000 kind of copies of viruses being generated. So this is a big puzzle, because, you know, if over 30 minutes we are only putting out 3,000 particles, then how can, you know, out of those 3,000 particles, that you would have to inhale a few hundred to get infected. So there is something kind of very, very puzzling about this that we don't understand about SARS-CoV-2. Maybe SARS-CoV-2 actually produces a lot more viruses, and the viral load of SARS-CoV-2 is much, much higher than SARS-CoV-1. And that is something that many, many researchers are out there trying to figure out. But it's not easy, because this requires close contact with somebody who's actually infected. And that is something that everybody is extremely careful about right now. Is the last thing you want to do is be working very closely with somebody who actually has a known amount of infection. Secondly, much of the infection is actually happening before the person shows symptoms. So how do you collect this information from somebody that you don't even know is infected? So this is kind of one of the biggest unknowns in my view, in terms of this equation. Fraction of droplets that aerosolize, how many of them droplets will actually get through? Again, size distribution, this depends on size distribution. The smallest ones are going to get aerosolized the most, and you can see here size distribution. Most of these particles come out in bimodal shapes. You get some large number of droplets at 100 microns, and then you also get large number of droplets at order of 1 micron. And these are the droplets that are going to aerosolize. So it seems like, again, we have a lot of data on it, but there seems to be a lot of spread. Of course, now here, immediately temperature and humidity start to come into play, because even in the 2 seconds that it takes a droplet to evaporate, temperature and humidity can play a huge role. So environmental conditions are another thing that start to come into play here. Okay, so that's one set of variables. Now this middle variable, right? This variable, which is fraction of these aerosolized droplets that travel from the infected person to the non-infected person. This is, to me, is another very, very complex variable, because it depends not only on the type of virus, because it seems like CoV-2 can survive much longer in aerosol form than CoV-1. So certainly the type of virus has a huge impact, but so does the location of the recipient relative to the host. If the recipient is very far away, of course, they will see very few viruses coming to them. If they happen to be close, they'll see more viruses. If they happen to be in the same room, different room, ventilation systems, all that thing starts to come into play. And then, of course, viability of the virus also requires humidity, temperature, UV exposure, and time of flight. So all those factors start to come into play. And there's fundamentally, outdoors is much better than indoors, because outdoors everything is diluted very quickly. Our breath is typically warmer than the outside atmosphere, except if you happen to be in India, where it's actually might be cooler. But most of the time our breath is actually going to evaporate. It's going to move upwards because of the buoyancy forces. So when you're outdoors, immediately your breath actually, and all these droplets actually move up, where they get circulated and they move away. So outdoors is fundamentally very much safer than indoors. In fact, there are studies from Japan that are showing that outdoors could be at least 20 times safer. Everything else being the same, being outdoors is 20 times safer than being indoors in terms of transmission. Indoors is a whole different game, because indoor you have ventilation currents. Every room is different. Every building is different. We ourselves create like a thermal plume from our body. Our bodies are warm, so they create a thermal buoyancy, a buoyancy-induced current, so particles can kind of move up. They can get recirculated by ventilation, by air conditioning. So indoors becomes a very, very complicated situation. In fact, at Hopkins and many universities, and I'm sure Harsh, companies are dealing with how to figure out things, how to deal with things indoors. So, and later on at the end, if people have questions, I can try to answer, because I'm involved with some of the kind of Johns Hopkins is a massive, organization with 10,000 people and 15 different campuses, and they're trying to figure out how to teach, work, study, and treat patients indoors while minimizing chances of infection. So I've kind of been in discussions with that group. And then finally, kind of the third set of variables, which is everything associated with the non-infected person. So those are three variables. One is the fraction of particles that a person would have inhaled if they did not wear a face mask. So this depends on how hard you're breathing, really. Really, it doesn't depend on anything else. Are you breathing tidal breathing versus very, very deep or kind of high volume breathing? So this is easy to estimate. We know a lot about this. The other thing is the duration of exposure. This is completely situational. How long are you exposed? So nothing to really predict. And then finally, this number, this N, this is again a huge unknown in terms of kind of our understanding about COVID. How many individual viruses need to lodge inside the respiratory tract in order to cause an infection? And this is the so-called, what is called the infectious dose, right? What is the infectious dose of SARS-CoV-2? And there's no studies on SARS-CoV-2 right now, because again, it's difficult to do studies where you try to infect a person and see how many particles, how many viruses it takes to infect a person. So those studies are difficult. They have kind of some data from SARS-CoV-1, and that indicates that you need anywhere from order 100 to 1,000 viruses to initiate an infection inside your body. There is also some data that shows that a single virus can start an infection. I don't know how much to believe that. There is a lot of data on tuberculosis that shows that a single tuberculosis virus lodged in the respiratory tract can start a TB infection. So this infectious dose seems to have a very large range, all the way from 1 for certain diseases to 1,000. it's not clear where SARS-CoV-1 is, SARS-CoV-2 is, COVID-19. My feeling is that it probably is much smaller. The infectious dose is much smaller for SARS-CoV-2 than anything that we have seen for similar viruses in the past. But I think it remains to be seen what this number is. And I'm assuming that it's not going to be a number, it's going to be a probability distribution function. I have to talk about face masks because it's something that we are working on quite a bit ourselves, and I'm totally, I'm a evangelist for face masks. So face masks. So remember, there were these two variables. I'm sorry, not FMH and FMS. They are face masks worn by the infected person, face mask worn by the susceptible. So they both appear as fractions, and this was the first time when I put this equation that it became clear to me that exactly what a face mask can do in terms of reducing infection. So N95 mask, all right? For an N95 mask, perfectly worn N95 mask, for that the F fractional filtration is going to be 0.05. So it filters 90, it's called 95 because it filters 95% of all particles. So only 5% of the particles make it through an N95 mask. So what that means is that if you are wearing an N95 mask and I'm wearing an N95 mask, and both are wearing perfect N95 masks, then we can get a factor of 400 reduction in transmission rate with a perfect N95 mask. All right, that is incredible, and that is partly the reason why Asian countries like Hong Kong and Korea and all that, I'll show some data, why they are doing so well and why countries like the US and Italy and Spain have struggled. HEPA filters go beyond N95. Their filtration is fundamentally significantly better than N95. They're not used in face masks, but they're used in filtration systems. So there, this FM factor is 0.0003. So imagine if you can actually have a face mask that is made up of a HEPA filter type material, you would get significant reduction in transmission rates. But despair not. Even a cloth mask is work. So here is some very latest data that I'm involved with reviewing papers that are coming out to separate trash papers from good papers, and this is one of the good papers, I believe. And these guys did a very good study where they said, okay, the vast majority of us are not wearing N95, we are not wearing some kind of professional mask, we are wearing some kind of cloth mask. So how well do cloth masks work? And they looked at N95 versus a mask which is a combination of cotton and silk, cotton and chiffon, and cotton and flannel. And I'll focus on this green. You see this green square. That's the range of particles where we are really interested in. Anything smaller than that is irrelevant for us. And here, by the way, you see that multiple layered cloth masks actually work almost as well as N95 masks. Their filtration rate is almost as good as N95 masks. If you look at the lower plot, the big problem comes in because of the gaps around the mask. It's the gaps that are the killers. If you don't have a gap around the mask, you get very good protection. With gaps, your filtration efficiency goes from almost 100% to 40%. But notice that even if you go down to 40%, if both you and I are wearing cloth masks, which are gappy and leaky, even then you get a 3 times reduction in transmission rate. So to me, it's a no-brainer that any mask helps. N95 is better than a surgical mask, is better than a cloth mask, but even a cloth mask helps. In fact, a cloth mask any mask has another kind of property, which is another very important effect, is that not only does it filter, but it reduces the velocity at which the flow comes out. So we've done some simulations there. This is a computational fluid dynamics simulation of flow coming out from a mouth of a person with and without mask. And you can see the velocities are reduced. So bottom line is that the extent of your out breath and the inhalation zone also reduces when you're wearing a mask. So masks are absolutely amazing. So given that, it's not surprising. This is some very interesting data comparing South Korea to Italy. They started off with somewhat similar infection rates, but South Korea mandated mask wearing and started distributing masks around this time. And look at what happened to their infection rates, whereas this is what happened to Italy. And then on the bottom is very, very interesting. Two adjoining countries, Austria and Czechoslovakia, both had extremely similar infection rates, but at some point Czechoslovakia mandated the wearing of masks, and the red line is Czechoslovakia's infection rate, and the blue line is Austria's infection rate. Eventually, notice out here, Australia mandated the wearing of face masks out here, and boom, their infection rates went down. So given that, in the meantime, this is what we are doing in the US. All right. Here is a vice president not wearing a mask in a hospital. Here is a president not wearing a mask where everybody else is wearing a mask. And here are people actually protesting that wearing a mask is like slavery, as if they know anything about slaves. So this is kind of where we are, and that's the reason why we are where we are. But anyway, enough of that. And then I can go into kind of other things as to why SARS. Now, once we have this equation, we can start to formulate a lot of things. You know, what about SARS-CoV-2 makes it more infectious? Then, if I look at that, you know, only these variables matter. Some of the other variables are not connected with the virus itself. And you know, I'll skip some of this. I'll come to the end here because I really want to go to the questions. So obviously, this inequality that I kind of have derived has a lot of limitations. For those who are more mathematically inclined, you know, this model, if you think of this as a model, it is non-unique and it's also incomplete. There's also likely some dependencies upon, these are not independent probabilistic variables, so there are probably some dependencies. And then most likely, instead of a number for the fractional value, actually we should probably have probability distributions placed there. So, but anyway, I thought, you know, this is kind of an interesting and useful way that I can explain this to the vast kind of range of colleagues that I meet here, all the way from medicine to public health to media to engineering folks. So I'll stop right there. I think I've taken a lot of time, so I'll stop right there, and I'll be very, very happy to take questions from my IIT buddies.
Hey, Rajat. Hey, this is Vishwa. Thanks for an amazing talk, man. So what I would do is, for people who are in the time zones where it's getting late, maybe they can ask the questions first, and then we can move on to people. I know everyone has a lot of questions. Even I have a lot of questions. But can we give them a chance first so that they can ask questions and then probably go to sleep? So people who are in odd time zones, can you please ask your questions now?
Hi, this is Amita. And I at the risk of asking potentially a dumb question among this gathering of buckets, as you mentioned, of which I am not, I just wanted to ask you, Rajat, is the mechanism through which this particular virus transmits or moves or transports, whatever the word is that fundamentally different from any other COVID viruses, or are we saying that the method of like, you know, the distance it travels, or, you know, the heavy droplets versus the light droplets, the ones that get aerosolized whereas the ones that don't, the mechanism is the same, but the issue is that this virus is stickier than other viruses? Is that so? If I look at just the common flu virus, would it also transmit in the same way from a fluid dynamics perspective?
Right. So this equation applies to every airborne transmitted virus. So everything from common flu to cold to tuberculosis to you name it, right? The question is, what about which factor here makes this COVID SARS-CoV-2 different, let's say, from the common flu? And one of the things is that one of the big things is that asymptomatic people seem to have a huge viral load, which they are shedding even before they have symptoms. So what is the meaning of that? What that means is that symptoms means that you are coughing or sneezing, right? So that's the first symptom, pretty much kind of a physiological symptom of this disease. in the past, flu and cold and all that is transmitted primarily through sneezing and coughing, because that's when the virus load starts to become large enough and the virus starts to shed. What we are finding with CoV-2 is that asymptomatic people have a huge viral load. And so what is happening is that they are transmitting this not through sneezing and coughing, but through breathing and talking. Now, the fundamental difference between droplets that are formed during breathing and talking versus coughing and sneezing is that breathing and talking produces very, very small droplets. And the smaller droplets can hang in the air much longer, number one. And number two, the factor, I didn't talk about this, but smaller droplets will also get inhaled deeper into the respiratory tract. And the deeper that the droplet lodges, the less protection the lungs have from an infection. So this virus kind of has figured out a very beautiful, insidious path, which is a path through breathing and talking, where the particle size is smaller, number one. Number two, nobody suspects that the person has a virus, so you're hugging that person, you're talking to that person, you're close to that person. And secondly, the small particles go deeper into the lungs of the susceptible, where they produce a lot more chance of infection.
Rajat, can you look at the chat? There is a question from Vineet also. This is the third from bottom left. Yeah, third from bottom left. Just look at the chat question.
Oh, chat. Sorry, chat.
Yeah, chat. Yeah, the third one from the bottom left.
Oh, wow. There's, let's see, a third. So I see a lot of stuff.
So you go from the bottom, maybe. Start from the
Vineet Gupta. All right. Dr. Gupta, my lab mate. Can FHS for a closed space be a vaccine is an average by considering net rate of production and absorption? So not really. Well, everything ultimately what we want to do is get some kind of an average rate for FHS for different environments. So certainly that would be the practical way of doing it. All I can tell you is that the FHS, hi Vineet, I can see you now. The practical point is that even in my office as I'm sitting giving the talk, the FHS changes if I turn on the air conditioner, I open the window, I open the door. It changes, hour by hour, minute by minute. So it really, an average kind of a rate over the entire day might be irrelevant to somebody who comes and sits with me in the morning. So that's the challenge there.
Okay.
Hey Rajat, this is I had a question. I don't know if anybody else has a question first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is actually non-scientific or I guess non-physical scientific in a sense, because all the variables in your equation they're basically related to physical sciences, right? I mean, rate of motion, the size of particle, etc., etc. I think what is the behavioral part.
No, behavior is there because depends on whether you're talking, laughing, speaking, loudly, shouting. So that's behavior.
Right. Let me just elaborate on that because I think that is So I think they are embedded in your equation someplace. But I was wondering if you could have two more variables added. One, which is the behavioral variable for the host, and the one for the recipient. So, for example, so there are people who are more likely to engage in the behavior, which will allow themselves to transmit more particles or not, for a variety of reasons. Their political beliefs, that they believe in freedom, whatever, Trump, etc., etc. The same thing is applicable to the other side. And I think that, in a way, is multicollinear with whether somebody wears a mask or not, whether they go out and exercise or not, whether they sneeze or not, etc. So I think having those two may enhance the accuracy of the model, assuming that we can control those variables by some policy measures or some incentives. It's just something to think about. If
Yeah,
you
no,
an explicit way to include that in your equation.
Right. So, so each of those variables, by the way, because each of those variables are multiple factors, in principle, every variable can be further broken down into further fractional numbers. And some of those numbers could be associated with behavior, some of them with physiology, some of them with situational. And so, Rohit, to your point, absolutely, I think behavior is a very important part. The question again is that, so for instance, the mask variable, that is a 1, that is a 0, I'm sorry, that's a 1 if somebody doesn't wear a mask. And it is something less than 1 if somebody wears a mask. So that itself, that's a behavioral variable in some sense, completely. The duration of exposure is a completely behavioral variable. How long do you decide to stay exposed to somebody, social distancing? Are you careful about social distancing and all that? The problem, the thing is that, it's kind of a double-edged sword to go too much into behavior when you're giving these kind of talks in a technical audience, because, that can raise the hackles of some people. I think it's implicit. I try to keep it implicit and not explicit too much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Rajat. Avinash here. I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding FSH, does temperature play an important role? Is there some research done or pointers to show that even within indoors, theoretically, if you were to raise the temperature, say about 40 degrees, 45 degrees Celsius or whatever that number is, that, say, reduces the variability and transmission rate to, say, 1/10 or 100 kind of a thing? Because that is something which can be done even indoors or could be applied or borrowed from other environments.
So there's a lot of data on temperature effects. So clearly, if you raise the temperature, the virus is a monotonic kind of decay rate of the virus with temperature. And above 60 degrees centigrade, typically the virus will not survive. All right. So virus will not survive very long once the temperature is high enough. It just gets desiccated and dehydrated completely. So that is for sure. If you raise the temperature high enough, it seems to not survive as well. And that might partially explain kind of why the virus, why the transmission rates in Asia and all that have been lower in general. Although there's a lot of other information, like still Korea kind of still had large amounts of infections and things like that. Humidity, there's a lot more complexity with humidity actually. It's not straightforward. It's not a monotonic function from what we understand. Transmissibility is not a monotonic function of humidity. High humidity seems to be good for the virus. Actually, even low humidity, for some reason that we don't understand, seems to be good. Intermediate humidity seems to be the worst for the virus. And we don't fully understand why that's the case.
So just as a follow-up, does raising the temperature intermittently can act as a good sanitation tool, for example, for restaurants and cinema halls or malls, where you create these small windows where instead of spraying the sanitizer and all of that stuff, temporarily raising the temperature to 70 degrees kills everything and it is sanitized for the next load of visitors? So,
in principle, yes, it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature, significantly and fast. In principle, I think UV light is what people are thinking more than anything else. UV based viricide. By the way, sprays and all that don't really work. Sprays are completely irrelevant because the concentration of these particles is, as the volume concentration is so small, that the chances that a virus-bearing particle will actually contact with a spray particle is 1 in a trillionth or something. So two particles will never contact each other. So there's no chance that a spray will help. So sprays are completely useless as far as airborne transmission goes.
Great, thanks.
Hey Rajat, this is Alok. I have a question. Can you comment on the efficacy of masks in terms of it being able to prevent the spread of virus from an infected person and compare that to its efficacy in protecting a person from a viral load from outside?
Yeah, so I spend a little bit of time on that. So if you're wearing a perfect N95 mask, then you basically reduce the amount of particles going out from your mouth by 95%. And if you're uninfected and you're wearing a mask, you reduce the number of particles coming into your mouth by 95%. So that is a very clear number. So if both
it's
are very
95% both ways, right?
Sorry?
It's 95% both ways.
It's 95% both ways. But what happens in reality, of course, is that no mask is perfectly fit unless you're wearing a PPE or something. There's always, as you all know, you've all been wearing masks, you see vapor coming out and clogging your glasses, right? So that means that there is a lot of air escaping from all peripheral edges of the mask. So that diminishes the performance of the mask, but that diminishes the performance more during exhalation than it does during inhalation. Because when you inhale, you automatically clear a low pressure and the mask automatically sucks onto your face. And so you get very good protection. When you breathe out, the mask automatically kind of moves outwards and it creates bigger perimeter leaks. So if I were to guess, I would say that outgoing protection is less than 95% even for an N95 mask, whereas incoming protection is probably close to 95%.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Rajat, this is Sanjay Tripathi. Hey, quick question. When do you call a person infected? When the virus reaches his nose, when the virus is in throat, or is it in lungs? Number one. Number two, in your Drake equation, shouldn't there be another variable that talks about going a virus from after inhaling, what percentage reaches the lungs?
Yeah, so I thought about that, and there is a nuance there that you're bringing up, which is very interesting. So, of course, when we breathe in and we breathe out, some of the particles that we breathe in, not all of them stick. Some of them can actually go back out. All right. And in fact, all of you smokers out there, you know, when you smoke in, some of the nice nicotine actually doesn't all embed into your lungs. It all comes out right away. So only a fraction of what you breathe in actually gets embedded in your respiratory tract. So in my equation, I actually included both by just saying this is the fraction that gets embedded. I did not differentiate between what comes in versus what gets embedded. But you're right, you can add one more variable in there if you want to break it further apart, is how much goes in versus how much gets embedded. Your first question about when do you call a person infected, that's a very interesting question, actually. I've thought about that myself. Is a person infected when they're, most of the time, what we say is a person is infected when they're showing symptoms. That's kind of the colloquial way of thinking about somebody who's infected, right? You only know when a person is infected when they are showing some symptoms. But clearly out here, that definition of infection doesn't work. People even before infection, or people who might never actually show symptoms, are still shedding viruses. So I think there's a little bit of gray zone in terms of calling somebody infected for this purpose of the equation. For my equation, anybody who can shed viruses, for me, is an infected person.
So how much a person how much virus a person sheds and so on also depends on the health of that person, right? So healthy people seem to spread less and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So they have found, for instance, that just simple age matters. Older people shed more droplets than younger people. Everything else being equal. People with asthma shed more than people without asthma for a given amount of volume of exhalation. So all those factors matter quite a bit.
So Rajat, I have two questions. One is very simple and one is a little more involved, I guess. So the first question is, what's the verdict on the food? Can it be transmitted through food when people are eating and chewing and swallowing?
Yeah, there is absolutely no data yet that shows that it can transmit through ingestion of food. So one thing is beautiful about Our saliva and when we are breathing through our nose. Nose is not lined by saliva. Nose is lined by mucus, and the rest of the respiratory tract is mucus. But then there is saliva in our mouth and our esophagus, and that saliva is acidic in nature. So it starts to kill stuff right away. As soon as stuff gets into your mouth with bacteria or virus or anything, it starts to take it apart very quickly. And our stomach is highly acidic. So anything that gets into your stomach most likely is going to be killed by the acidity in the stomach. So very, very small chance. But despite that, Vanna will not let me go get sushi because she thinks that uncooked food is still unsafe. So I've not been able to get sushi. But as Aditi knows, I've started to make sushi at home because of that.
Okay, Rajat, one question. So what are the next steps from your side and what you're recommending and so on?
Well, I think masks. I think there is no doubt that is the simplest way you can protect yourself and your family. All right? Wear a mask if you're going to go out anywhere. I was on a flight day before yesterday, a 7-hour-long flight, and time will tell if I'm still safe. I'm still, I need 2 weeks to know whether I saved myself or not. But I actually wore 2 surgical masks on top of each other. Layering matters. Every layer you add to your mask increases your protection. So I put on, both me and Vanna had double surgical masks, and we made sure there were no leaks around. When people were around us, we were making sure. So time will tell if that protected me, but I see the face mask as the most simplest, cheapest, easiest, most non-invasive way of protecting yourself. And other than that, the vaccines, vaccine. Sanjay and I have been talking about vaccines a lot, and I know something about, and many of you might know this, working in the medical field. There are vaccines on the way, but for instance, the Moderna vaccine, it's an mRNA-based vaccine. If it's successful, it will be the first ever vaccine, mRNA-based vaccine ever. We have no clue what happens to a person who takes that vaccine 5 years from after they take the vaccine. We have no idea, and we will have no idea until we have tested this out for 5-10 years to see what the long-term effects of this brand new way of doing vaccination is. And so even if a vaccine is available, I'm somewhat, I'm not going to rush and get a vaccine. I want to see some long-term results of what this does to the body long-term. I've been involved in enough kind of clinical, not trials, but medical device trials and all kinds of other trials to know that there is a lot that is hidden in the rush to market. There is a lot that is done that should not be done. And if there has ever been a rush to market, it is right now for these vaccines. They are short-circuiting every effort that is well known to provide the right amount of information for vaccines. So I'm not an anti-vaccine person. I get all the other vaccines that are proven or anything. But I don't think vaccines are going to be the panacea for this, not at least in the foreseeable future. In the foreseeable future, I don't see anything other than masks that does better in terms of protection.
So Rajat, hey, so that's on the protection side. I know prevention is the best way right now. But is there another person or you yourself are capable of who can give us what are the feasible ways of beating this virus through cure or vaccine? How does that process work? Because the best minds of our times are here. My hope is that if we collectively put our brains together, maybe this batch will do something special for this planet. That's what I'm trying to drive towards.
So, the thing is that, the development of vaccines is squarely in the world of cellular biology, microbiology, virology. So, it's difficult to see if you're not in that space. I don't know how you get involved in the development of vaccines, but Vishwa, I don't think that this group, I think there's a lot of other things that where this group can really contribute. For instance, I think ventilation systems, I think that is something that gets closer to hitting home for all of us, right? Home ventilation systems, office building ventilations, understanding filtration, those are all the places where, those are all arenas which are squarely kind of in the realm of engineering, which is kind of where many of us are. And by the way, this connects a lot with data science and machine learning. Data science is being used for everything. You know, tracking, this whole idea of tracking, I'm sure at Google, Vineet, there's a lot of effort in terms of
Rajat, exactly. I feel like some out-of-the-box thinking is required. And what can happen is that when people like Vineet and others look at this, they might look at the problem very differently from the usual ways people have done things so far. So somehow, I want this badge to be what people call as the idiot. The idiot didn't know this was impossible, so he went ahead and did it. I won't rule that out. I don't want to rule that out at this stage, because the traditional ways are not working. It's kind of obvious.
Hey, Vishwa and Rajat, this is Rohit again. Let me make a plug in one more time for a behavioral part. And I think a lot of people here can help on that. So, so clinical or medical solution is one way to deal with this problem, right? So let's take a look at a different problem, diabetes. Okay, so a lot of people in the world have diabetes. Diabetes can be solved by taking diabetes pill or injection, or you can change your lifestyle. And then the recent medical work in last 10, 15, 20 years basically says that you can take pill as much as you want, but it's the lifestyle, people's behavioral change is the one which is more effective cure. So if you assume that this analogy applies here, I think what Rajat said about people wearing masks, etc., it's really about people's behavior. I just think that if this group of people who have so many influential people in all walks of life, people who are IAS, people who are in the major technology companies, people who are senior officials in large corporations, people who are working in universities, if we try to encourage people in a positive way to, wear masks, take those protections so that the droplets don't go from person 1 to person B, I think that could be a stronger and more influential cure than just a clinical or medical solution. So I know this is not what is taught in IIT, but I think this is one of the valuable lessons I have learned over time, and I just wanted to see what other people have to think about that. Thank you.
So let me just, if I can add to what Rohit is saying. So there are lots of, I don't know, we have an illustrious group here, a lot of people very high up in public policy and decision making, either in government or at large companies. I think it doesn't matter whether it's large companies or government organizations. You are in the business of enhancing good behavior in some sense and protective behavior. In Korea, and I was talking to the public policy expert here, in Korea, South Korea, how did they beat the disease? Every week, every person gets 3 N95 masks in mail from the government. All right? Every week, every person gets 3 N95 masks in the mail. So they have no reason not. Right now, I'm a so-called expert on masks, and I go on the internet trying to buy the right mask for me and Manna and the family. Even I can't figure out which mask is actually a good mask versus a not so good. It's all a lot of BS. All companies are saying all kinds of stuff where it's impossible to figure out, what is the true quality of that mask. And so this is where government and companies, large companies, can come in and say, okay, we are going to provide that quality control. We're going to provide everybody in our company with a mask. I think that's where the behavior change starts,
Hey, Rajat, hi. This is Rajat. Hi, this is Ajit Narayan. How are you doing, buddy?
Hey, man. How are you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I know. Hey, listen, Rajat, thanks. Yeah, I've been listening to all this great deal of interest, but unfortunately, to me, at the end of it all, it's still as clear as mud as to what's going on. But this concept of this airborne transmission, do you think it's statistically important or statistically high enough, the airborne transmission, to warrant policy response. Because that's very crucial, because if that is statistically relevant, then governments and other people and people like us who have a lot of people working for them will have to take certain decisions which prevent airborne transmission. Whereas if it's not statistically relevant, then maybe it's not required, because a lot of these lockdowns, etc., are causing people a lot more harm than perhaps having COVID and recovering from COVID.
Yeah. So by the way,
hey, Rajat, can you stop your screen sharing so people can see you?
Oh, how do I?
Just go to the bottom left and just press there once.
I did that. Nothing happens.
Just try once more. Yeah. Now it's fine. Now it's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So yeah, Ajit. So I think first, two parts to your question. I think first is the airborne route compared to the droplet route and the fomite, the contact route. Which one is more statistically relevant? There is tremendous amounts of data now that is coming out that shows that. And by the way, this data has existed since SARS-CoV-1. This data has been well known in Asia, and that's the reason why we always wonder, why are they doing that? It sounds stupid, but actually they know something that we don't. They've known this through SARS-CoV-1, which is 2008. That airborne transmission is the most important, because there is no other transmission route that is able to do such widespread infection, because one person can produce enough particles to infect an entire crowd. Whereas the contact route, this whole idea that droplets fall onto a surface and then somebody touches them and then brings that hand to their mouth or nose. Imagine how many different variables you need for that to happen, first of all. Secondly, actually our skin is an extreme virucidal agent. Virus survives less than 5 minutes on our skin. Virus can survive 3 hours on plastic, 1 hour on steel, blah, blah, blah. On our skin, it survives less than 5 minutes. So the contact route and the droplet route, okay, the first one is somebody needs to sneeze in your face and you need to have your mouth open and your nose open and breathing in for you to be able to get that. All the data is showing, and by the way, there's this famous case in Hong Kong, this restaurant, this was one of the first cases in China, where a family that was infected was sitting in a restaurant in one corner, and they ended up infecting people in different parts of the restaurant. That was the first clear evidence for COVID-1 that actually this long-term airborne transmission is the biggest route. So about a month ago, about 250 scientists actually wrote a letter to WHO, to CDC and everybody saying that, guys, stop ignoring this. You have to start recognizing that all the data is pointing towards airborne transmission. The reason why WHO has been very resistant to this is because there is a lot of policy issues and behavioral issues that they kind of try to deal with. Their thought is that in poor countries, if we come out and say that airborne transmission is deadly, then what happens in hospitals in India, where they don't have the ability to filter, they don't have positive pressure environments where you can keep air out? What will happen? Will people stop going to hospitals? Will people be scared of going into hospitals to get treatment for other critical diseases? So WHO is making decisions kind of, in my view, mistakenly by looking at kind of all kinds of other factors. They are not really going clearly based on data. Based on data, the fact that wearing a face mask in countries like Korea and Czechoslovakia, there's clear data that infection rates basically drop down to 0, says that aerosol transmission is the dominant route. So that's quite answer number one. And question number two, you were talking something about whether having coronavirus and recovering from it is better than the lockdown. The point is that there might not be a need to lock down if one were to actually instigate measures that significantly reduce infection rates. So right now in South Korea, they don't have lockdown. In Singapore, they don't have lockdown. In countries where they have controlled the infection, they actually don't have lockdown. People are coming back to their lives. They are wearing masks. They are doing whatever they can for social distancing. So I think the two are not really mutually exclusive. I don't think we need to expose ourselves to coronavirus in the hope that we'll recover and everything will be fine, just because we don't seem to understand how it's being spread. We know how it's being spread.
So in buildings, should we ask for these HEPA filters to be fitted in building? Would that be a helpful thing?
So yeah, so HEPA filters. Yeah. So HEPA filters quickly. This is relevant to everybody because we can all install HEPA filters inside our house. So two or three things about HEPA filters. One is that HEPA filter, of course, since it's filtering, is going to increase the pressure loss across the filter. So your ventilation system has to work a little bit harder, more power consumption and all that. But let's say it typically increases power consumption of a ventilation system by 10%, 15%. Let's say we can agree that we are willing to deal with 10% increase in our electricity bill. The other problem is that the virus that is stuck in the filter is still alive. So somebody has to go after a week or day or a month and replace the HEPA filter with a new filter, because that filter is now completely clogged by droplets that are filled with viruses, and those viruses might be alive. So one needs to constantly update those filters. By the way, that's what they use in aircraft. They use HEPA filters. So that's number two. You need to worry about upkeep of these HEPA filters, and whoever's going to change it will have to wear all kinds of PPE and everything and protect themselves. Number three, HEPA filter only protects the air that goes through the filtration system. But what about the air that has not yet gone through the filtration system? If I'm sitting in an office building, office room with 15 other people, I'm breathing in everything that they are exhaling. Maybe somebody else in a different room is going to breathe the air that has actually gone through the HEPA filter, but it doesn't stop infections from happening within the room. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. That said, we are not going to have a perfect solution. HEPA filters might be part of the solution.
So Rajat, I mean, the cruise ship example, I mean, kind of proves that, right? I mean, people were were left on the cruise ship, and eventually everyone got it. They had to get them out of there.
Right, absolutely.
Hey, Rajat, Suranjan.
Hey, Rajan.
Suranjan, not Ranjan. I had a couple of questions kind of related. First is, what's your take on these double infections, repeat infections of people? So I've got infected, I've recovered, can I get it again? And second is, where do you see this? The earlier SARS and MERS and all of these other infections have come, and kind of the impact has depleted over time. Do you see this COVID-19 being a different impact, continuing impact, and therefore this need for social distancing, masks and all that to continue to prevent infection?
All right, so first answer to the first one. I'm not really a virologist or epidemiologist, so my answer, I'll give that with a grain of salt. Double infection, so it all depends on there are different types of antibodies that are created by infection. So certainly, we get infected by the flu all the time, right? Again and again. We get infected by dengue all the time, again and again. I got infected. So there are lots and lots of virus-borne infections which do not, once you get infected, do not give you protection next time. So SARS-CoV-2 seems to be in that spectrum where it seems to be a large number get protection, but a small number don't get protection even after they're infected. It's just a problem. It's a bell curve. It's just the thickness of the bell curve and the tail of the bell curve where it lands for this particular virus. There is for the Moderna vaccine, actually, they are finding that the antibodies are created by the vaccine, but those antibodies tend to diminish fairly rapidly over time. So this might apply to vaccines also. Second question, what was the second question? Remind me.
Second question was, where do you see this going? So everybody protects themselves, infections die down. Does it come back like the flu? So
yeah, no.
Distancing masks are a thing of forever.
So there's the notion that this will become the new flu, right? That in the future, this is going to become like the flu. There was a time, of course, that lots of people used to die from the flu itself, and now we've become very good at treating and vaccinating people against the flu. So, I don't have a crystal ball, but there is certainly some validity to that thought that this just becomes part of the overall kind of ecosystem of viruses that we have to deal with in our future. That said, SARS-CoV-2. So the estimates are that there are 500 trillion different SARS-CoV viruses that exist in the kind of the zoonotic universe, right? All the bats and all the animals. 500 trillion distinct viruses exist. So there is constantly an experiment going on. These viruses are constantly experimenting in some sense. When I say experiment, of course, I mean just by the process of evolution. They're constantly kind of probing to see, if they can find weaknesses kind of in our system. And SARS-CoV-2 found this beautiful, so to speak, morbid but beautiful way of infecting people very rapidly, and primarily because of the spread of infections, I believe, from asymptomatic individuals. I think that is the key way in which SARS-CoV-2 has figured out how to defeat us for now. So I think there are other solutions, by the way. There is a very simple solution people are working on, is that if you increase the so how do you treat so one is, how do you treat infection before it starts? How do you get people not to infect other people before they even know that they're infected, right? That is what vaccinations do. They basically provide.
Hey, Rajat, I wanted to bring one more point. I think hasn't been raised yet. So that's about testing. So in my past, I did some work on type 1 and type 2 error in any statistical test. So take a look at all these COVID testing right now. Some are very sophisticated, or some are not so, right? And then some people are saying that, okay, we should do maybe random tests across population, and then some people are saying we should only test people who have some symptoms or not, right? So basically, all of these boil down to the accuracy of the test, the probability of the error, and what % of population should be tested. And the end result, basically the reason of all of this is because what we want to do is, let's say an individual is infected, in your model case, the host. What is the likelihood that this person will transmit to the recipient? So maybe you can comment a little bit about, what's your view about how often people should be tested, who should be tested, the accuracy of testing, meaning should we have a very good testing method, so it's very accurate, versus a low accuracy but a wide range testing? Maybe you can share some of that thought, because that's also a really big point. And I know in universities, this is a big deal, because some universities are saying, like yours and mine, we are saying, okay, let's do more testing or less testing, etc. So maybe some thoughts about that, and I think it will be relevant also to people who work in companies.
Right. So I know a little bit about. Yeah.
Rajat, before I'm tagging on to Rohit's question, right? And my daughter is also listening. She has a question on the same line. Any studies done on a closed room environment, and should she go back to the dorm, how much she should get tested if she go back to dorm? So if you can comment on that as well.
So, So I'll answer the second question first. I'll come back to the testing. So dorm, right? That's something that my daughter is a senior is going to be a senior in college. Thankfully she doesn't live in a dorm. She lives in her own separate housing outside. Dorm there at Hopkins, for instance, they're saying that we are only going to have single person per room, and fewer rooms are going to be occupied, blah, blah. I still don't understand. They're going to be sharing bathrooms. They're going to be sharing corridors. They're going to be in all kinds of common spaces. What happens if 2 or 3 people get an infection? Do you immediately shut down the entire dorm at that point? Or so I really kind of throw up my hands. I understand the difficulty that the schools are facing. On one hand, they do want to, the kids and their parents, in some sense, want the education that they are paid for. So the universities are keen to bring back, at least some students back onto campus. But, I don't know how you do that in a safe way. Connected with testing, most of the tests take 4 or 5 days to come back with the result. So forget about, so there are 3 or 4 factors for testing, right? The sensitivity, specificity of a test, positive predictive value and negative predictive value of a test. How good is that? Second thing is how non-invasive and easy is it to take the test. And third is how quickly you get the results from the test. So in some sense, if testing has to become effective as a way to help all of us get back into normal life, then we need good testing, which has high positive predictive, low negative, high accuracy basically. We need the test to be not very invasive, where you don't have to have go and get your blood drawn or something like that. And secondly, we need the results ASAP. We can't wait for even 1 day for the test to come back, because in that 1 day, the student or person might infect 10 other people. So I think those are the challenges. Now, all of that seems to be doable, right? Pregnancy tests takes, what, a minute? Something like that. So we have that tests like that exists. And I think that's where, again, technology and the people on this call, I think there might be a lot of people who could contribute to the testing aspect. I think there's a lot of very interesting work that is happening at the intersection of physics and engineering and science in the realm of testing. Back to Rohit's point, I think I tried to answer that, Rohit. So I think those are the 3 or 4 kind of demands of a good testing protocol. It needs to be accurate, it needs to be fairly non-invasive, and the results need to come out very quickly.
What about the cost and the frequency? Like, they also play a major role, right?
Yeah. No, cost, they have to be free. I think the question of cost shouldn't come in. If you are going to force a person to pay to get themselves tested so that they can protect other people, it's not happening. So I think that's
the frequency, right?
Frequency all depends on the I think it depends on how fast the results come, and it also depends on how easy the test is. If the test is as easy as me putting my finger on a piece of paper in the morning, and the result I get the result right then and there, then I don't mind doing it 5 times a day.
Rajat, what about antibodies testing related to infection testing?
Yeah, so I'm not a real expert in this, but there's multiple ways in which you can do testing. Like you can test for antibodies, which is an indirect test of whether the infection was ever present, or you can test directly for the RNA of the virus itself, which tells you that actually the virus is present. So they both have kind of their strengths and their weaknesses in the way the tests are done, the accuracy of the test, the complexity of the tests, and things like that. An antibody doesn't really tell you whether the person is currently infected. It only tells you that, yes, the person at some point
was infected,
was infected or was exposed. Doesn't even have to be kind of infected. They all they need is a little bit of exposure.
So I got viral testing done and through my company, and it took them a couple of hours or less to give the results. But again, I don't know how accurate viral is versus antibody. But it seems like it was pretty rapid. I was surprised how quickly
Yeah, so I think companies can certainly do that. They have the resources, and they have a captive audience in some sense, right? They can make it mandated that every person working in the company has to be tested, and guess what? We'll pay for it. So I think that's certainly a kind of a good place to start. In terms of the accuracy of the test, the viral test, somebody else might know more about this than me. The antibody test is about a 60% accuracy. So pretty low, actually. 60% is pretty low. The viral, the RNA test, what is it called, the PCR test, that has a higher accuracy. and it's good to know that it's happening in 2 hours. That's pretty good. I don't know what the expense of that is. I don't know who's bearing the expense.
Yeah, the company bears it, of course. In my case.
So Rajat, one other question. So I always keep hearing about the viruses mutating.
Right.
So what does these mutations mean? I mean, how can you create a vaccine for something that is changing all the time?
Right. So there we have a little bit of good news with the SARS-CoV-2. The mutation rate of SARS-CoV-2 is a lot less than the flu, which is a lot less than the common cold. The reason why we don't have a vaccine against the common cold is because literally there are 800 billion types of cold viruses out there already, and they're continuously mutating. So there is no way we can keep a vaccine hopefully at some point we'll come up with a vaccine that attacks something that is so fundamental about the virus that it is not affected by mutations, but we haven't reached that stage yet. Flu vaccines, so the COVID vaccine, SARS-CoV-2, from what they're saying is the mutation rate is anywhere from 2 to 8 times slower than the flu, the common flu. So, which is good news for vaccine. There's a reason why we get a new flu vaccine every year, because there's enough mutation, blah, blah, blah. SARS-CoV-2 seems to be mutating much slower. But what is happening though is that right now the SARS-CoV-2 the virus is undergoing one of the largest human trials possible, right? It's infected tens of millions of people around the world. So it has a very large game that it's playing right now. It is trying to figure out strains that are actually going to spread very fast. When I'm saying this, of course, I don't mean that the virus is intelligent or anything. It's just through the sequence of evolution, it is actually playing a very large game right now. So who knows? Already they know that the virus strain in the US is more infectious but less deadly. So there is the GNP, it's the G and the 2 alphabets in the key alphabets in the RNA sequence among the people in the US seems to be different from that in Asia and other places. So already the virus that has taken hold in the US is slightly mutated version of what is in most other places. And this virus is more infectious but less deadly, apparently. So who knows what the future is going to bring, because like I say, the virus is conducting a very massive experiment of evolution right now. And so it is trying to find that one strain that will now again bloom and try to grow very fast. So who knows?
Hey, thanks. And what about people say don't touch your eyes? What's the connection with eyes here?
I looked at that when I was writing my paper. I searched and I've continuously searched. There is not a single published paper that shows transmission through the conjunctiva. Now, what has confused people, and I think that's why everybody says this, is that when you actually extract tears from an infected person, you find viruses in that tears. So what that means is that the tears are infective, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the eyes can be a pathway to infection. So, however, there are other viruses where you can get transmission through the eye, like we know, conjunctivitis and all that is transmitted through the eye. So there is a possibility that it could be transmitted through the eye, but there is not a single study that I have found that shows that actually.
So Rajat, this is Rajiv. Quick question. Really enjoying the session here. Very insightful. I was wondering, what is the steady state you see us going forward towards? Is there a critical threshold that we need to reach to go back to normal, whatever you consider normal? Or you think this is a new normal that we are entering and we just, sooner we get used to it, the better?
So, used to it in the sense, I think used to it means very different from somebody who has gotten a family member infected and got into serious health problems versus somebody who doesn't know a single person who's been infected. And that includes me, by the way. I don't know anybody in my close family of friends, touch wood, who has been infected. So I feel like everything is normal in some sense, but you talk to somebody who's died or somebody who's gone into serious medical problems, their normal and what they consider going back to normal will be very different. But back to your question, there's a lot of work done on kind of the R value of the virus, right? The R number is a critical, in population dynamics, you need R value of greater than 1 to really grow a population of anything. In a virus, you don't need the value to be less than 1. You need it to be close enough to 1 for it to be able, for community kind of infection to be able to be suppressed. So I think we can go back to those kind of countries are showing that you can do that, right? Korea and all these other countries are showing that you can go back to a kind of a new normal where you can start to open up businesses and schools and everything else. But you have to be disciplined, number one. And number two, your rights and your responsibilities to your community are as important as your rights to whatever it is that you call it. I think as long as you do that, we can go back to normal. We might have to wear masks, big deal, right? People are dying. So what's the big deal in wearing a mask? So I think that's, but I think with testing and vaccine, so testing I think has a lot less danger and a lot more promise. Wearing masks has zero danger and a lot of promise. Vaccines have a lot of promise, but they also have a lot of danger. I think we will not know the long-term effects of especially the new vaccines. If you take an old vaccine that has worked for Tamiflu or whatever, all these other vaccines, and Pfizer figures out a way to tweak that a little bit and make it a little bit effective for COVID-1, fantastic, I'll take it tomorrow, because I know that vaccine has gone through 20 years of long-term testing. We know what the long-term prognosis is. If somebody says, oh, I have an mRNA-based vaccine, this is the first mRNA-based vaccine, it's going to give you 90% protection against this vaccine, but we have no clue what it does after 5 months of taking the vaccine or 6 months after taking the vaccine. I'm going to wear 3 masks instead of that. And I'm going to go about my life wearing masks.
Yeah, but Rajat, but on masks, I agree. I think, public places, I nowadays sometimes take public transport in London. I wear a mask and go and all of that. But if you're sitting in the office for 6 or 7 hours, it's really impractical to wear masks, isn't it? I mean, it's highly, highly impractical. So, yeah, we'll see what everyone does.
Yeah,
some of us, most of us have elderly parents now, right? And they are the most vulnerable part of the population. So I was thinking maybe for them, having this vaccine might be a good idea. But as you say, most of the vaccines that have been developed have taken, years before they were really approved. And so, you wonder whether that's a safe option. So yeah, especially for parents, one really worries about how do you protect them, right? Because they're most vulnerable.
Right.
Rajat, on this, I have 2 questions. This is Atul here. One is, when would you be willing to take a vaccine? And 2, any views on food-based transmission? Any ideas there?
So food-based transmission, I think we talked about it a few minutes ago. There's no data out there that really shows that food-based transmission is a significant factor at all. When would I be wanting to take vaccine? Like I said, if it's a well-known vaccine which has been tweaked and is showing some level of protection against, I think that's a safe bet. If it's a brand new vaccine with brand new delivery system and everything, I don't know. I think we all have to evaluate what risk. I think all of us have to evaluate in the end the pros and cons and the risks that we are willing to take, right? And so I think it all depends on all of us, whether you have elderly parents, whether you have some other underlying health conditions, this and that. For me, I would want to wait at least a year to see an mRNA-based vaccine showing no fundamental lasting side effects. So right now, the side effects that they're showing for the Moderna vaccine is, little bit, they don't have any they have a little bit of a rash at the site of the injection. They have a little bit of a fever, blah, 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 blah. They call that side effects, and they're saying that there are very few side effects. I don't disagree with that. But they have absolutely no data on what this vaccine does after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. And remember, this is not a vaccine that is going to be one shot treats you forever. In fact, there's a very interesting discussion with Moderna. The antibodies don't survive. Antibodies don't survive forever. There's an exponential decay in the antibodies created by a vaccine. On the other side, there is some level of mutation happening in the CoV-2 virus. So those two are both going to force you to take this vaccine again and again. What that period is going to be, we don't know. Is it going to be 2 months? Is it going to be 1 year? Is it going to be whatever, right? It's going to be some period. So you're not just going to be taking this vaccine one time. You'll be taking it multiple times. So do they know what happens when you're vaccinated by an mRNA-based vaccine and you're vaccinated multiple times? What happens after 5 years, 10 years? What are the effects? This is brand new territory. Nobody's ever taken mRNA-based anything ever. All right. So they might have some animal studies. They'll do some mice studies, and good thing is mice have a very short lifetime. So in principle, 1 day of their life is equivalent to kind of 1 year of our life. So they might extrapolate from some of that, but in the end, you need to know that in humans. There's so many examples. I don't know if any of you took Vioxx. It's for people who play tennis and their knees start to hurt and all that. Vioxx is an anti-inflammatory medicine, right? Pfizer or Roche were amazed at the performance, and they marketed that medicine for like anything. And then they found out the incredible long-term side effects of Vioxx, and they had to pull that out of the market after about 8 or 9 years. During that 8 or 9 years, they made billions and billions of dollars. But the side effects were so bad that that medicine had to be pulled off the market. I used to take Vioxx. I used to play tennis, but my knees used to hurt, and I used to take Vioxx like there was no tomorrow because it made me feel good. My knee pain went away. I was ready to play tennis the next day. But so there is a lot of, you have to think really carefully. These vaccines are, I can tell you one thing for sure. The rush to vaccines in the United States has a huge political factor associated with it. Because if that vaccine doesn't come out before November, it means a lot of different things to different people. Let me leave it at that. But if a vaccine can be declared found before November, it could help somebody quite a bit.
You're right. Rajat,
yeah.
This is Alok. I got a question for you. So we, I got offshore rigs in Gulf of Mexico. We test everybody going offshore. So we see about 1 to 2% instance where people are positive on PCR. Okay. Now, what is your understanding of the real population? What is the penetration of COVID in real population? Because when I look at New York, the instance has decreased now, the new cases. While Texas, where I stay, it's quite high. While the behaviors are very similar, what the shutdowns and lockdown, people are doing exactly the same. So is that New York has a lot more people already with COVID or antibodies in their system, so they have lost less instance of COVID over there?
Yeah, that's
Raja, show that second slide. Raja, show that second slide, please. This is Sanjay Subhasan. The protester slide.
That's a good question, difficult question to answer. That what is the true penetration rate of the virus in the population? So again, the beauty of this virus is that people who are showing no symptoms might be infecting other people who end up showing deadly symptoms. All right. So this virus has figured out a way to be infective even without showing symptoms. And some of those people who are infecting other people might themselves never show any symptoms at all. So, true rate of population penetration of this virus, we would only know if everybody got tested every day, with a perfect test. So I think there's a huge question mark in terms of our understanding about 2 penetration rate. The second question was New York versus Texas. So there, by the way, there is a huge gap between mask wearing in Texas versus New York now. Even after kind of mask wearing has become a little bit more acceptable in the entire United States, the compliance in mask wearing is a lot lower in places like Texas than it is in New York. So there is certainly a huge role that might be playing in diminishing the rates in places like New York and other places. Other than that, I really kind of don't know the answer to that question. So there is a couple of people asked me whether this is a synthetic virus or not. So there's all these conspiracy theories that China somehow created this beautiful virus and initially killed themselves a little bit and then really killed everybody else. So personally, I don't think it's not a synthetically created virus. There's enough proof. There are very, very clear ways, almost like carbon dating is very, very accurate in terms of telling us the age of things. Genetic testing and counting the number of mutations, the type, rate, and location of mutations in any organism is a very good way to figure out whether something is synthetically manipulated or something is naturally mutated over the last millennia. And all the data shows that it is not a synthetically manipulated organism. That doesn't mean that maybe it got released accidentally by the Wuhan clinic, which was set up in Wuhan in the first place because Wuhan was the epicenter of many epidemics in the past. So the Chinese government set up the Wuhan clinic, the virus center, and it's possible that it kind of escaped from there by somebody who was infected and came out and infected other people. But there is clear proof that it is not created synthetically in any lab. I can refer people who are interested in this. There are multiple papers in Nature and Science that address exactly this question. And by the way, these are not papers published by Chinese authors. These are papers that are published by multiple research teams from Europe, United States, Korea, and other places.
Hey, Rajat, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Ashish Mehra here. Can you hear me? Hi. So my question is, sometime back, Rajat, you were alluding to doing something. You were talking about vaccines. You were about to say something about how to increase the mucus or something where you could be more of a preventive measure.
Right. So that actually, so the question is, can I ask all of you to do something very simple to yourself every day that could reduce the rate of infection for everybody, right? So that's a simple question. And one technique is actually increasing the viscosity of the mucus in your respiratory tract. If you increase the viscosity, fewer droplets are going to be formed because droplet formation is an interplay between surface tension, viscosity, and kind of inertia of the flow inside. So it turns out that if you take an inhaler with even a saline solution inhaler, and you inhale a saline solution, it actually diminishes it increases the viscosity of your mucus significantly. So there are companies that are trying to come up with very, very low invasive techniques where during the season of COVID, let's say that COVID becomes like the flu season, right? Which is October to whatever, April. During that time, they will recommend that people start taking this inhaler of a certain type of a saline solution every day as a way to diminish the amount of droplets that they are forming on a day-to-day basis. So that's a kind of a different way of approaching this problem also.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. And what about the other side? That means boosting immunity so that your chance of getting infected goes down, whether it's stress management, whether it's more nutrition or better nutrition, more hydration, any of those techniques?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I missed out some keywords there.
No, I was asking if on the other side, for the recipient, if lifestyle changes can be made to boost immunity to reduce the likelihood of actually getting infected.
Yeah, so So apparently our man from Baba Ramdev has a solution. Apparently he's come up with a drug that works really well without any testing. But there's no simple answer. It's like the answer to, is there no simple answers. Lifestyle, obviously, being generally healthy, having good respiratory health. I think that's the key part here, right? It doesn't matter what your glucose level here is or whatever, but it does matter whether you have good respiratory health. Now, if somebody who has asthma, is certainly at a higher risk, or pulmonary, somebody who has COPD or somebody who has emphysema, stop smoking. That's one thing that you can do to improve your respiratory health and make you better at fighting with COVID is you can stop smoking. But other than that, everything else one would recommend is what would recommend for being a healthy person in life. There is no kind of simple panaceas there either.
But is there, for example, specific things around Kriya or these breathing exercises? I've heard some people talk about when you do those kinds of breathing exercises that Art of Living teaches and so on, that may help. I don't know if that's true or not.
No, like I said, I think I do respiratory yoga exercises myself, and certainly, and my mother-in-law is an asthmatic patient. She's done it. She feels and gets so much better when she does it. No doubt that these kinds of exercises help your respiratory health. As a scientist, when somebody says these will help or are helping with COVID, I would like to see some actual proof, some studies with double-blind testing and things like that. Then you can make that statement. But I don't see how they would not help. Now, the one thing you don't want to be doing is doing this Kriya in the presence of somebody who's infected, because if you do deep breathing in the presence of somebody, an instructor, yoga instructor who's infected, it might go the other way for you.
Yep, agreed. Thank you.
Hey Rajat, this is Alok again. Do we know how these viruses are encapsulated in droplets? Do they migrate to the surface? Being hydrophobic, I would assume they would be on the surface, or are they encapsulated in the volume, the net volume of the droplet? Because that will have an implication on how many virus particles you could carry in small droplets versus larger droplets, because smaller droplets will have a higher specific surface area.
No, that's a great question, and I'm curious about that myself, because that kind of connects with fluid dynamics very directly. So, and I've looked for studies that have actually caught a virus-containing droplet and then done some AFM or SEM microscopy to see exactly what that droplet, the kind of the anatomy of that droplet. And I haven't found anything yet that would kind of answer your question. The thing is that droplet contains more than the virus, because we have a whole bunch of kind of biomolecules in our mucus also. So the droplet is water with a lot of biomolecules, proteins, fatty molecules, all kinds of other molecules, and then there is also the virus. So it's not kind of a binary mixture. It's a very complicated multi-component mixture, and nobody's really, and I'm puzzled by why nobody's managed to kind of catch a droplet, so to speak, and visualize it. I haven't found anything yet. Maybe if some of you are interested, if you find something, some analysis of the anatomy of the droplet, that would be kind of interesting for me for sure.
The interesting thing with this virus is, it's this so-called retrovirus, right? Which is RNA. It doesn't even have a DNA. It has an RNA, and then it goes into the cell and actually converts itself into a DNA, apparently. This is the simplest form of life you can imagine, and maybe that's why it is so insidious.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to mention, because it seems like even if you get affected, there's very little chance that you're going to die. You'll most likely recover. So I don't think, we should be too scared if it happens to us. It feels like everyone is just I mean, it's more about not spreading it too much. So it's a great thing to do. But I mean, if it just happens that one of us gets it, I mean, I don't think it's the end of the world, hopefully, right?
No, yeah, no. Statistically, of course, it's just like most other situations in life, right? Statistically, you can't. Chances of getting hit by a truck when you're crossing a road is small and all that. So I think here also, even if you get infected and you are generally kind of in decent health, you should be okay. I should point out though one difference though between this virus and other viruses is that, especially like flu and all that, the one thing about this virus is its ability to overwhelm a completely healthy person depending on the infectious dose that you get. All right. So that is somewhat scary part, is that you can be perfectly healthy 25-year-old person, but if you get a massive load of this virus, the reaction of the body to this virus can be sufficient to overwhelm the system and actually lead to very significant health consequences. That is not true for lots of other viruses, by the way.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about. I don't know what it's going to do long term to my body. Maybe it feels like I've recovered, but 6 months from then, maybe some organ will start failing or something like that. Is that?
No, long term, actually, no, there's no. So we already have about 8 months worth of data on kind of long term effects of these viruses. If you recover from anybody who recovers from this virus, when they recover, their body tends to recover very nicely. But the problem is that perfectly healthy people with no history of respiratory disease or other comorbidities, even they seem to get completely overwhelmed by this virus. Statistically small number of samples, but enough of those. Now that will hardly ever happen in a common flu. We are very good at, somehow we have figured out how to deal with it. Our bodies have developed enough exposure antibodies, etc. So long term, at least 8 months down the road, we kind of know what 8 months down the road looks like in terms of having an infection and recovering from it.
So, by the way, you mentioned that you don't know anyone. I thought there was one of our batchmates that he actually succumbed to this.
Is that right?
Yeah. Hey, Rajat, one question that came up is, how does blood type affect the rate of infection? I read somewhere that O type has less likely versus A type or something like that. Anything you can share on that?
So, yeah, I don't know. Actually, I've never heard of that. I would find it very unlikely that that's the case. Given that blood types have really no implications for other types of coronavirus infections. But one thing I should point out to all of you guys, and this is my pet peeve. There are, at this point, I'm on a group at Hopkins whose job is to separate trash research from good research. And we are not even talking about unpublished research. We are talking about research that is appearing after peer review. And we are actually re-reviewing peer-reviewed research. And we are finding even journals like Nature and Science are publishing complete crap on this, more so than ever. And there's 2 or 3 reasons for that. Of course, everybody's interested. It's an interesting research topic. I'm interested in working in publishing, so there's a lot of people interested. Journals are very interested in taking in papers on COVID because it increases their readership. Number 3, they are accelerating. I review a lot of papers, and in the past, they used to give me a month to review a paper. With COVID, they want the paper review in 1 week because, it's a fast-moving situation, and the paper might become, something you say is true might already be proven untrue in 2 months or something. So they want to get that paper published before it can be proven false. So a lot of this, now what the media does is the media picks up the spiciest kind of papers, published or unpublished papers, and then they amplify that information through media. So if you see any data, keep clicking on the source If you see a New York Times article that refers to a paper, go and click on that source and see whether it's a paper that involves a major research study. It should involve multiple hospitals collating data, this single group coming up with some information. Yeah, we found something or the other. That, or much of that will be proven to be untrue or somewhat true or somewhat not true when more and more studies are done. And that's the reason why this whole hydrochloroquine that our Mr. President is very keen on kind of selling to everybody. It was shown to be not effective. Then it was shown to be effective. Then it was shown to be not effective. And the reason for that is that these are all isolated studies, and you can always tweak the results. You can always show the best results to prove anything. When you want to see a clinical trial of anything, it needs to be what is called a multi-center trial. Multi-center trial is that multiple hospitals completely separated from each other conduct the trial in a completely blinded manner. And then a third party actually analyzes the statistics of all the data and then produces the analysis. That is what is called a multi-center trial. Unless you have that, all you have is kind of incidental kind of findings that people are reporting. So this blood type thing, I would be very surprised if it is the result of a real kind of a clean multi-center trial.
Makes sense. Thanks. Yeah.
Hey, it's been like 2.5 hours now. I think we should probably give Rajat a break, unless somebody has a very pressing question. I think
I
we
will
should.
stick around for a couple more questions. I'm having fun. So
you need to hydrate yourself. You need water.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I was noticing as well. And then one question that Vineet asked Rajat is, can the slides be shared?
Yeah, I can certainly share the slides. I'm actually writing a paper on this COVID inequality. So hopefully the paper is going to be, it's kind of unpublished work, but this group of people, I'm absolutely happy to share the slides with.
Okay, no, I mean, you can share after it's published. That's fine too.
Either way, I'm happy to share it also. No big deal.
Hey Rajat, this is Rohit. Before I go to sleep, it's about 1:30 here, so I may not be coherent. I haven't had any alcohol, but I may still not be coherent. But one thing I do remember, your equation is very impressive, man. I think if one thing we can all build around is that, and you are absolutely right, the Drake equation, from what I know of, really influenced people for maybe 2-3 generations, and other people who know more about that topic can second it. But
what are the chances of finding the ET then?
Yeah. I mean, I watch every single episode of Star Trek, even though I don't understand the science behind it, but it's unbelievable. But my point is that I think creating a fundamental theory like that is quite influential. And then what I really liked about your theory is that you have multiple factors. You have the host factor, you have the behavioral factor, which I talked about, you have biological things, you have physical things. I think if there were a way to easily explain that equation, that makes a lot of sense. And it has policy implications, it has implications for companies, universities, etc. So I don't know if you can do some type of follow-up on that to make it a little bit more easily understandable for people on how they can use it. I think it have a huge impact, in my opinion. I think a lot of papers like this, you don't need a lot of data, but you need to really inspire people, basically. And your equation has that potential. So that's all I wanted to say before I go to sleep.
Thank you.
I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, but I thought that was just really good. That from my limited understanding. Thank you.
No, I reciprocate, Rajat. I think that equation distills this whole mystery of this virus that we all read about in various places, and this equation distills it out very clearly. So it's a great theory, I think.
Since Rohit talked about sci-fi, I mean, it always bothers my mind. Can something like this wipe off humanity? I mean, in the future, I mean, something much bigger like this comes up, and
So yeah, so that's very interesting, right? That you can ask the question, why did Ebola not spread the way CoV-2 has spread, right? And that therein lies a little bit of good news for us, is that any virus that is fast moving and very deadly typically will not have a chance to spread very far. And that's the reason why things like Ebola, etc., are very deadly but very localized infections, epidemic. So hopefully we will not get wiped out by an epidemic like this. We might, I think there's other things that might wipe us out, like global warming and an asteroid coming and hitting us. I think by the very nature of the way these infections work, the most deadliest infections actually don't get a chance to spread very far and very fast.
I think now we are chance to Surajit to chime in, and then it'll be another 2 hours.
Hey, Rajat, but the other factor is how long the virus takes to kill somebody. So say if the virus is deadly and it spreads fast, but it's deadly in the sense that it takes like a year to kill somebody, then that would give it an opportunity to wipe out mankind.
Yeah, and all those if conditions have to be satisfied for a virus to become a kind of a planet killer, right? And there is principle, it could be possible, and we have already seen with Corona that Corona figured out how to satisfy a few of the if conditions to get it to being very spreadable and somewhat deadly. We can only hope that there is no virus that figures out to be very spreadable and very deadly.
Yep. Yep.
Hey, Rajat, this is Uncle. In a lighter vein, the virus is telling us to keep our mouth shut, not sneeze, not breathe. So anyway, it's telling us to kill ourselves, yeah?
No, Uncle, just keep drinking.
You did say increase the humidity and the moisture, right?
There we go.
Yeah, and alcohol kills the virus. So that's the
alcohol totally kills the virus. That's why you have all these, and actually single malt works the best.
Yep. Okay, and so does Drano and everything else that our president is telling us to inhale or drink.
Yeah, well, I'll let him drink that. I don't want to try. I like my single malt better than Drano.
Yep, exactly.
I mean, so is there some truth to it, Rajat, that you just keep some alcohol kind of thing in your and keep drinking a little bit and keep it in your throat? That'll help.
I don't think so. Because again, no. Unfortunately, not.
Yeah, I mean, like Baba Ramdev kind of.
How about this, Vishwa? Instead of spreading this misinformation in this big group, I have a separate talk with you, and I give you the recommendation so that you're good.
Oh yeah.
And Vishwa, beautiful लोगों को कोई ना कोई excuse चाहिए था दारू पीने का, so.
Hey, Rajat, one last question. So you had mentioned in your talk that the virus is very intelligent and it has figured out a way to spread, and that's why we sneeze. So is that the brains behind the virus that's causing us to sneeze, or is it the fact that our body is trying to recover and trying to expel the virus? Which one of those two is it?
So the normal reaction, normally we sneeze and cough without having infection, and that is a normal reaction of our body to try and expel something that is irritating our respiratory tract, right?
Right.
So that's the normal function of sneezing and coughing. Other than that, sneezing and coughing doesn't have many other protective functions for our body. What the virus is doing is making us cough and sneeze a lot. And that is not a way of the body to try and expel the virus. Like, it's not trying to protect itself by expelling the virus. That's not what the body is doing, from what I understand. What the virus is doing is it is producing the same kind of irritation, the reflex for irritation in your respiratory tract that is created by other types of particles that get into your mouth and nose. So the virus is kind of hijacked that aspect. Now, by the way, of course, there are other infections that hijack your gastrointestinal tract and make you have diarrhea, and they spread via feces, right? So there are other viruses that have figured out the other opening of the body to try and kind of infect and create infection. So all these viruses have come up with different modes of hijacking normal functions of your body to make it easy to spread themselves. Of course, when I say intelligent, especially in the United States, I have to be careful and say that this doesn't mean intelligent design. I'm not talking about intelligent design. I'm talking about kind of evolutionary processes.
Yeah. Yeah, the virus don't have brain cells.
You mean this virus will pass the cognitive test?
Oh,
certainly the one that Mr. Trump took, certainly.
Oh, I'm sure it will pass the first 5, but the last 5 apparently are very, very difficult.
Rajat, this is Basu here. I just had a quick question. You talked a lot about masks. In India, people, generally are not using N95, etc., and people are using very basic cloth masks. Sometimes a dupatta, just a little bit around the face. How effective is that, and how many layers of cloth mask, is really effective?
Right. So I kind of covered that in a fair amount of detail earlier in the talk. So bottom line is that any mask is better than no mask. Any mask. A cloth mask, N95 is better than a surgical mask, which is better than a cloth mask.
Right,
but a cloth mask with multiple layers of kind of cotton and silk actually works almost as good as the N95 mask. So, yeah. So, even simple masks that have multiple layers of cloth, the reason why silk and cotton kind of having 2 different layers works is because one mechanism of filtration is kind of electrostatic attraction. So silk can actually get electrostatically charged by itself a little bit. So it'll actually capture any particles that have any level of electrostatic charge. So that's why multiple layers really help.
Okay, so at least 2 layers and preferably cotton and silk combination.
Well, so I'll send you, if you all want, I can especially send that slide which shows, so cotton and they have tested cotton chiffon combination, cotton silk, and there was another one, cotton and flannel. And all of them kind of work equally well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Are you saying, Rajat, that even when one goes jogging and stuff, one should be wearing a mask? That's like it's, you just can't. You can't breathe.
Yeah, no.
Is it better to die without breathing?
Yeah, no, I see. So personally, I go out for walks and runs and all that. I don't wear masks, but I make sure that I don't. In the US, it's easy to have social distance when you're doing those kind of things. We just don't have enough people. So outdoors, I think the chances of getting an infection is very, very small unless you're in somebody's face. I think if you're 6-10 feet away from somebody, the chances that you will get enough of an infectious dose from that person are very, very small. Would have to be a real unfortunate incident that all the air from that person somehow manages to come to you. As I had said before, we're actually doing simulations and all that show that outdoors, your exhaled air immediately starts to rise up, and immediately it mixes with the ambient airflow, and it dilutes very, very quickly, and it doesn't come down again. It keeps rising up quite a bit. So outdoors, you are very, very safe in my view. Don't sue me if you get infected while running outside without a mask. But I think outside you don't need to wear mask unless you're in crowded situations and you're in close quarters with people. If you're going out for a run or something and you can make sure that you can avoid getting close to people as you're running, I personally don't wear a mask when I'm doing those kinds of activities.
Hey Rajat, this is Harsh. I have a last question before we go back to sleep here. So the Drake equation that you showed, it's a bunch of factors, probabilistic factors that are multiplied to each other, of course. But each one of these factors are extremely complex, right? I mean, I'm sure this time integral, as Vineet was saying, of course it has to be, right? At different scales too. There would be, the time scale would be different. So what's your next And obviously you can't. No one can study all of it. But what do you think is the most important part of that you are investigating next?
No, so like I said, I'm not a virologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a fluid mechanician. So to me, there's two things that we are studying. One is face masks. We are trying to understand. So what happens is when you're breathing out, the face mask moves in and out, and that's creating a lot of leaks. So we are trying to use computer simulations to kind of design a simple, optimized mask that actually produces as much outward protection as inward protection. The other stuff that I have a PhD student looking at very fundamental mechanism of how droplets are formed inside the respiratory tract, and how if you change the viscosity of the mucus, how much does that reduce the number of droplets coming out? So that's me as a mechanical engineer and a fluid mechanician. But in terms of the bigger questions, the bigger unknowns in that equation, I think the viral load and the infectious dose, those two numbers, I think are the biggest unknowns, I think, in this equation.
Awesome. Very practical. Thank you.
All right, great. So I think that's, maybe it's time to call it quits.
Absolutely. I think, but thank you so much, Rajat. I mean, this is the most amazing talk actually I've heard in a long time.
I'm glad. I'm so glad that my buddies liked it. I don't think I've given a talk with a more receptive and friendly audience. Usually there's always a couple of a-holes who are trying to poke holes into you. So this was nice.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, and if you come across any problems where you think anyone from this group can help, I mean, for example, Vineet, I mean, I don't know if he's still there. He was one of the real brains behind Google Brain. I mean, he can. He'll probably be doing a talk later in one of the webinars. So
I think in that regard, I think because I don't know what everybody else is doing, but everybody else now knows what I'm thinking. Anybody who has any ideas about any factor in that equation that they can contribute to or anything else, reach out to me and let's talk. And even if I'm not an expert in everything, I can at least direct you to the right people.
Perfect. Hey, thank you so much.
All right, great.
Thanks.
Fantastic seeing all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rajat. Thanks, Babua, Vishwanjan for arranging it.
Yeah, thanks, Vishwa and Sandeep for setting this up.
Yeah, I mean, I know we are almost at the peak of our careers, so everyone has a great story to tell. I mean, so everyone be ready. When people are thanking me, I mean, it'll be like you'll be asked next.
All right. Great.
And Sandy, your Voxmox works, man. It works very well.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's why I'm staying up so late. I'm staying up late to hear this.
Yeah, I think a huge thanks to Sandeep, man. I mean, this is unbelievable.
So just for the case, like people who are there. So Sanjay's talk has 3 versions now. One is a 5-minute summary, and then there is a 50-minute, and then the 2 hours. So now
my
this
God.
one, yeah. So if you go back on the same page, you have those summaries. So we will try to do something similar for Rajat's talk also. So I have something which is edited version so that people can go through it.
And I think for the slides, I think people should reach out to respective people. I mean, the speakers there directly. That might be better, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
All right, guys. And ladies.
Yeah, take care, everyone.
Thanks, Rajat. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.